Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the NASA SpaceX Crew 11 mission. You're looking at a live view of that small dot there, which is Crew 11 on board Dragon Endeavour. I'm Jesse Anderson, a senior production manager here at SpaceX, and I'm joined by Joseph Zakrzewski with NASA Communications. We are just under a couple hours away from the final approach and docking of Dragon to the International Space Station. Overall, this will be Dragon's 49th visit to the space station and its 19th human spaceflight to the orbiting laboratory, including the Demo 2 flight test, 10 NASA Commercial Crew Program rotation flights, and 4 Axiom Space private astronaut missions. And this is SpaceX's 5th Dragon mission just this year.
Now, as we continue to get those great views of Dragon making their approach to the International Space Station, let's look back over what their journey has been like these last 16-plus hours for them, as launch day preparations started early this morning for our crew members. About 4 hours prior to launch, the crew completed their final medical checks before joining the SpaceX team to get into their spacesuits. And there you can see that those preparations well underway. And after suit-up, NASA operations and checkout in the building, the crew walked out, waving some final farewells to their family and friends waiting outside. The next destination for the crew was then the launch pad, and that's where they would board their Teslas and take a short ride to Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the Falcon 9 and the Dragon spacecraft were awaiting them. 2.5 hours prior to launch, the crew ingressed or entered the Dragon spacecraft, walking over that crew access arm and enjoying some of those last views of the Space Coast, heading into the White Room and eventually into the spacecraft itself.
And at 8:43 a.m. Pacific time or 11:43 a.m. Eastern, the 9 Merlin 1D engines ignited and Falcon 9 lifted off from Launch Complex 40, beginning Crew 11's journey to the International Space Station. Following stage separation, the first stage booster supporting the mission performed a boost back burn to bring itself back to the launch site where it landed at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station on Landing Zone 1. Then a couple minutes after that, we had a good orbital insertion of Dragon, followed by a few minutes later by spacecraft separation. We are currently waiting for the approach initiation burn coming up as our next milestone, but there have been a few burns already that have brought Crew 11 to where they are currently at in their journey.
And with that, too, catching up to where they are, the Dragon spacecraft a little under 12 kilometers away, closing in at a rate closure about 4.4 meters per second. And that brings us to the journey they had to take to get there. And as we approach the approach initiation burn, and that first burn would occur about 30 minutes after liftoff earlier this morning, in which Dragon would execute the first major burn known as the phase burn, which is performed at the first apogee, or the highest point of the initial orbit. And that raises Dragon's perigee, or the lowest point, to a higher altitude. This was the first of 5 major burns using its Draco thrusters required to raise Dragon's orbit and position it for approach to the International Space Station.
Then earlier today, that sequence of rendezvous and phasing burns continued as Dragon executed the boost burn, and that was at 12:27 p.m. Pacific time or 3:27 p.m. Eastern. The boost burn put the crew in an orbit where Dragon's apogee, or the highest point of the orbit, was 10 kilometers lower than the station. But raising only the apogee of Dragon's orbit isn't enough for a rendezvous where we want to dock. Before we can approach the station, we need Dragon's entire orbit, not just the highest point, to be effectively shadowing the space station. Now, to do this, Dragon executed the close burn at 1:11 p.m. Pacific time, 4:11 p.m. Eastern time, which was just about a half orbit after its boost burn.
And then the close burn would place Dragon on an orbit roughly co-elliptic with the International Space Station, meaning it was maintaining an orbit roughly 10 kilometers lower than the station the entire way around the Earth. And again, that's in contrast to only being 10 kilometers lower than the station during Dragon's apogee, or the highest point of its orbit, which is achieved by the boost burn beforehand. After that, Dragon performed a mid-course out-of-plane burn to continue to fine-tune its trajectory and align its orbital track to match that of the International Space Station. And that boost burn would take place, or out-of-plane burn, at 2:03 p.m. Pacific, 5:03 p.m. Eastern Time. And then less than an hour later, at 6:13 p.m. Pacific, a lot happening in a short amount of time, the fourth major burn would occur, known as the transfer burn. And this is where Dragon raised its apogee, or highest point of its orbit, to just 2.5 kilometers lower than the International Space Station.
Yeah, and I love this graphic following along with each one of those burns so you can understand what's happening with Dragon. Dragon then finally rounded out everything with a final co-elliptic burn at 6:59 p.m. Pacific, 9:59 p.m. Eastern Time to once again maintain a constant orbit lower than the station, this time just 2.5 kilometers below the station. Now, this was a shorter burn lasting just over 30 seconds.
Now, as we approach the approach phase and the approach initiation burn, which is about a little bit more than 10 minutes away at this point, we enter the approach phase where SpaceX flight controllers will work with tandem with the team at NASA and in Houston to maneuver Dragon to the proper attitude. They will initialize the navigation sensors used for the methodical approach to the station. They'll also activate and test out a number of systems on Dragon, including the bidirectional communications with the station using what's called the C2V2 system. Now, that stands for the Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. You can see where the acronym comes from right there. It sets up a data stream from Dragon to the station, giving another path for Dragon's telemetry to come to the ground and giving an additional command capability to astronauts aboard the orbiting laboratory.
Now, that's what Crew 11 has been experiencing so far on their journey to the International Space Station. But looking ahead at approximately 9:49 p.m. Pacific Time, Dragon's Draco thrusters will fire for the approach initiation burn. This will take place when Dragon is about 2.5 kilometers below station and about 7 kilometers behind it. The approach initiation burn will bring Dragon about 400 meters or a quarter of a mile directly below the station. Now, a small approach initiation mid-course burn is planned for about 25 minutes later. These maneuvers will also move Dragon inside one of 2 checkpoints around the station that requires a set of go-no-go polls with the different control teams. Now, the first checkpoint is called the approach ellipsoid, or as you may hear us call the AE. The approach ellipsoid is an imaginary shape measuring 4 by 2 by 2 kilometers, and it's essentially a large 3-dimensional oval. Now, before controllers give Dragon permission to move inside the approach ellipsoid, the spacecraft will be on what is known as a 24-hour safe trajectory. This means that if Dragon lost all control to its thrusters...
SpaceX Dragon on Dragon to ground. Comm check from seat 3.
Mike, I have you loud and clear on Dragon to ground. How me?
We have you loud and clear, and seats 3 and 4 are suited. The other 2 are momentarily.
Copy all.
Comms from the core to Crew 11 as they're donning their suits. Now, before the controllers give Dragon permission to move inside that approach ellipsoid, the spacecraft will be on what is known as a 24-hour safe trajectory. This means that if Dragon were to lose all control to its thrusters, it would be at least 24 hours before its trajectory would move inside of that approach ellipsoid.
And once Dragon arrives at the 400-meter mark below the station, it will be known as what is Waypoint 0. And that will be the first checkpoint during their approach to the International Space Station. The vehicle can hold here at the 400-meter mark, but if all of its systems check out, and we'll hear calls about it a little bit later on, Dragon can continue its approach to Waypoint 1. Dragon's move from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1 will swing it up and over top of the station as they'll be docking to the zenith port of the Harmony module today of the International Space Station, and it'll be arriving at a distance of approximately 220 meters. At this point, it will be on what we call the docking axis, which is essentially meaning it's directly in front of the space-facing docking port, and again, on the International Space Station's Harmony module. Just before arriving at Waypoint 0, the NASA and SpaceX teams will conduct a go, no-go poll for Dragon to move inside the now keep-out sphere, another checkpoint that consists of an imaginary sphere around the station with a radius of 200 meters. Flight controllers use this to monitor all arriving and departing vehicles, and this is another chance to confirm all of the guidance, navigation, and control systems are working correctly on Dragon before moving even closer to the station. It carries a similar requirement on this orbital trajectory that if Dragon were to somehow lose control of its thrusters, and the space station would be safe for 4 orbits or about 6 hours rather than the 24 hours required to enter the approach ellipsoid.
Then once Dragon has approval to move inside the keep-out sphere, it will move from Waypoint 1 in toward Waypoint 2, which is just 20 meters away from the station. Once Dragon is only 20 meters away at Waypoint 2, the spacecraft focuses on aligning its docking system with the International Docking Adapter, or the IDA. We may also hear the call-out CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands-Off Point. Now, this happens a little less than 30 seconds before docking when Dragon is just a few meters from the docking port. And then at that point, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon. And the grand arrival, when our crew arrives at the space station, Dragon will fly in and make contact with the IDA, giving us what we call a soft capture. The soft capture ring then retracts until sensors indicate it's time for 12 hooks to drive in place to give us a hard capture and then firmly secure Dragon to its new home on the space station.
Now, once the hard capture is confirmed, the station crew aboard the International Space Station, namely NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, will manually start to begin the docking procedures and manually pressurize the vestibule, or the area between the Dragon hatch and the International Space Station hatch. Meanwhile, umbilicals that provide power, audio, and data connections from the station to Dragon are then put in place. And then it's time for leak checks and hatch opening, which are currently timelined to come a little more than 2 hours following the docking. So right now we're continuing to track along, and we heard comms earlier between the ground and the crew. They're getting suited up to provide that extra layer of protection for them and pressurize those suits as we're entering another round of dynamic ops. It's been a busy day for Crew 11 after launch earlier this morning. So that approach initiation burn coming up in about 8 minutes or so. So we'll see and hear more communications as those crew members continue to get dressed up.
Yeah, Crew 11 is currently coasting. They've got a couple more hours on their flight from launch this morning. And we did attempt a launch yesterday morning, but due to weather, had to move the launch this morning. But they're still docking around a similar time, which is great for them. They have a little bit of a shorter trip. Or I guess they could have had a longer trip on Dragon, which may have been a pro for them either way.
And if they did launch yesterday, it would have been about a 39-hour phasing period
right.
versus the 16 hours that you mentioned there. But even then, I feel like they might be a little anxious and excited to get there, because even at this moment, with the approach initiation burn and the anticipated docking time, which right now tracking around the 2:26 a.m. Eastern Time, approximately 11:26 p.m. Pacific, that's still about 30-ish minutes, half an hour or so early. So you know that these Crew 11 members, with Commander Zena Cardman, pilot Mike Fink, both of NASA, and then you also have Kimi Yue of JAXA and Oleg Platonov of Roscosmos, again, getting suited up, getting ready for that approach initiation burn. But you heard it in their comms after the launch today, and those special words, a lot of emotion, a lot of excitement, I'd imagine, knowing that, you know, at the end of a trip, when you're hitting your destination, that excitement continues to ramp up.
Yeah, and I'm sure Zena is very excited. She's been ready since last year, so I'm really excited to see her finally flying her mission. And there you can see the map, and you can see the destination for Crew 11. That's the International Space Station. That is where Crew 11 is heading to.
And right now, the International Space Station making its way across the Pacific Ocean, and it's heading towards a southern southeast trajectory. So it's going to start to clip that southern portion of South America there. But yeah, as they continue that slow and methodical approach, they're approaching about 9 kilometers away from the International Space Station and closing in at a rate about 4.3 meters per second. So they're still moving along. And again, we're continuing to track that approach initiation burn, which we're going to be about 4 to 5 minutes away from that moment. But once they reach the International Space Station, they will become members of Expedition 73. And that already has 7 members on board. And taking a look at who's going to await them, we mentioned NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers. She's going to be a part of the hatch opening procedures that'll happen a little bit later on here today and tonight, or I guess tonight and this morning, depending on what coast you're on. But also NASA astronaut Johnny Kim. He's in the cupola, the window to the world, and he's using special technology to help monitor Dragon's progress as they continue to inch closer and closer to the International Space Station.
Yeah, I'm sure both crews are very excited to meet each other. They are going to have a handoff period. This is very typical with NASA crew rotations, where we have about a week of time, depending on the mission and what needs to be handed off to each other. But this gives them that full handoff with each other before Crew 10 returns back home.
And right now they're targeting for Crew 10 with that handover period of about 3 full days. And that'll be a familiarization of the International Space Station for 2 first-time flyers in Zena Cardman and Oleg Platonov, Cardman of NASA and Platonov of Roscosmos. They certainly want to make sure that they get their bearings, they know where they are, how to operate everything that they need to, but also the handover of research, technology demonstrations, everything that Crew 10 and Soyuz MS-29 have been working on, and then able to hand that off from Expedition 73. And then, of course, Johnny Kim, NASA astronaut, will depart with his Soyuz crewmates a little bit later on in the fall, and that's when Expedition 73 will turn into Expedition 74. But as you mentioned, right now they're targeting no earlier than the 6th of August for that handover period. Certainly a lot has to play in favor. The weather has to cooperate as well. A West Coast splashdown anticipated. It'll be the first NASA crew that'll return to the West Coast. So a lot to look forward to. But again, right now, Crew 11, they're just anxious to get back into their suits for that extra level of protection again as we continue to track AI burn, which is approaching about 3 to 4 minutes away from now. And we'll be sure to walk you through that. But for this crew and knowing what they've gone through and how flexible they have been, whether it's through weather yesterday or everything that's had to happen in their careers, it's been a flexible group, but a very grateful group. And I know that that is going to be a mentality that's going to carry not only through docking today, but throughout the course of their mission.
Yeah, and Joseph, you mentioned that they are getting suited up in their suits. They do have to put on their suits when they're going through some dynamic events, including docking to the International Space Station. These suits just help keep them safe, keep them cool, in the unlikely event of a depressurization inside of the cabin during the docking operations. So they'll put their suits on, they'll get strapped in with their harnesses into their seats, and then once they're all ready to go, they can begin the process to dock to the International Space Station.
And we'll continue to hear those comms called out from the core here in SpaceX and Hawthorne and their headquarters up to the crew. Of course, they'll do similar checks, leak checks, pressurization checks that we heard at launch time. They'll initiate all those procedures as they get ready for that approach initiation burn, again, coming up here in the next couple of minutes. But you mentioned the suits themselves. One thing that we talked about during the launch earlier this morning was that one of the astronauts, Colonel Mike Fink of NASA, is wearing one of the new IVA suits. Now, when you look at the crew all lined up, the 4 of them across, you can't really tell the differences. Everything seems, at least visually, the exact same, but I'm sure it'll be exciting for Fink to don that suit again, and I'd be curious to get his reaction knowing what his other crewmates are wearing as well.
Yeah, that's what I love about SpaceX is that the crew really helps create the suits here, and you can see this animation on the screen. Now, the IVA suits have a 3D printed helmet. They're still very similar to each other, but there's been some upgrades. They do have a little bit more mobility on the new IVA suits. They've taken a lot from the extravehicular suits and have a little bit more mobility there. One of the top updates for this suit is that the suit is a 2-piece suit. So you can see on the waist where it looks like there's almost a seam there. On the new suit, that's where the zipper is, where they can separate the top part of the suit from the bottom part of the suit. Makes it a little bit easier to get into the suit. Now, the old IVA suit is 1 piece. They do have one zipper where they're going through and putting on the whole suit. So the new updates, again, feedback from the astronauts, the crew that has been flying with SpaceX, has been able to give this feedback and allow us to make these updates that make it a lot easier and make a lot of improvements that are coming from the people that are using the suits.
So as we get updates and the crew in their suits now, we just got note that the approach initiation burn is underway, and that's one of the big key milestones now for the Dragon spacecraft to continue its methodical approach to the International Space Station. So certainly some good news there is everything continuing to move forward as Dragon continues that stair step to catch up to the orbiting laboratory.
As we continue in towards docking, let's take a closer look at the Dragon spacecraft that is bringing Crew 11 to the International Space Station today. The Dragon spacecraft and its trunk stands over 27 feet tall. There are 2 windows on the spacecraft. The nose cone opens shortly after launch to expose the forward bulkhead thrusters and docking mechanism that will connect with the International Space Station to the IDA. Dragon's trunk holds solar cells, which power Dragon while it's in free flight, and the trunk can also carry unpressurized cargo, so there's a lot of space on the spacecraft.
And Dragon has 16 Draco thrusters that can be used in space to help navigate the spacecraft to its destination, each providing 90 pounds of force. Now, that doesn't include the 8 Super Draco thrusters used for an abort, which are no longer active once the crew is in orbit.
Yeah, Dragon has played a significant role in advancing our future in space by safely transporting crew to and from the space station. And there are currently 5 Dragon spacecraft supporting human spaceflight missions that have docked to the International Space Station already. Endeavor, Resilience, Endurance, Freedom, and Grace, which you could see there on your screen. Today's crew is flying aboard Dragon Endeavor. This is the first operational Dragon to carry crew on board during SpaceX and NASA's Demo 2 mission in 2020. Endeavor has been very busy since then, having also flown NASA's Crew 2, Crew 6, and Crew 8 missions, as well as the Axiom 1 mission. And in fact, this is the first Dragon spacecraft to fly for a 6th time.
And with that, it's the 6th time they have completed the approach initiation burn, which just got wrapped up just a few moments ago. And now Dragon tracking to be a little bit more than 7 kilometers away from the International Space Station and moving about 4.8 meters per second. So it was a good burn and everything moving quite along and swimmingly for the NASA SpaceX Crew 11 team. Now, overall, this is Dragon's 49th visit to the space station and its 19th human spaceflight mission to the orbiting laboratory. Including Crew 11 on board right now, SpaceX has now flown 74 crew members to the space station since the Demo 2 mission in May of 2020. And actually hearing from the SpaceX team earlier today that this is actually the anniversary of the splashdown of Demo 2 and the return of astronauts from American soil. So Endeavor, which was that spacecraft for Bob and Doug, now docking the International Space Station on that 5-year anniversary. And for nearly 25 years, crew aboard the space station have completed thousands of scientific and educational experiments, and Crew 11 is prepared to add to that growing number. Crew 11 will conduct hundreds of science and experience and technology demonstrations during their mission, in which they will spend multiple months working aboard the Orbital laboratory. Having more crew members on board significantly expands the amount of research that can be conducted, and this crew will conduct their new scientific research to prepare for human exploration beyond low Earth orbit and benefit humanity on Earth. And some of those will be directly intertwined with the Artemis campaign that'll send astronauts back to the moon and beyond. So it'll be fun to see what they're able to participate in during their long-duration stay.
Yeah, always very exciting to see what these crews can do. Some of the more than 200 research and tech demonstrations Crew 11 will participate in include a set to study plant cell division and microgravity's effects on bacteria-killing viruses, as well as perform experiments to produce a higher volume of human stem cells and generate on-demand nutrients. Overall, the hundreds of research and tech demonstrations the crew will work with throughout their mission span a wide range of disciplines, from life and physical sciences to advanced materials, technology development, in-space production applications, and even some student-led research. And not only will all this research provide valuable insights for future deep space missions of exploration and help establish a market in low Earth orbit, it will also directly benefit humanity here on Earth. When astronauts engage with students worldwide via the ISS ham radio program, researchers will use the ham radio hardware to test software for Navigation and Communication Test Bed, or NAVCOM, that could help shape future lunar navigation, which is a personal favorite of Mike Fink.
And that was something that he talked about a lot during the media breakout sessions that we had with him. Is for him, during his last mission, which was 14 years ago, it was an opportunity to communicate with not only people in North America and in the United States, but he had a chance to communicate with people all across the world and took a lot of pride in that he got to speak with everyone on each and every individual continent. So I know that's probably an experiment and technology that he's really excited to dive back in. Expedition 73 is also scheduled to conduct a Bionutrients 3 investigation, and that's producing essential nutrients on demand in space using engineering microbes like yogurt and yeast and helping offset nutrient loss during long-duration missions. The study also tests food safety, including pasteurization, while exploring sustainable techniques for deep space travel. And that really ties into the Artemis campaign. As we do missions further and further out, you're going to need to have those opportunities to preserve your food and be able to produce food when you're a little further away from home. Now, there are currently 7 astronauts and cosmonauts living aboard the International Space Station as a part of Expedition 73, as we continue to follow along and track the path of Crew 11 here this evening. Following Crew 11's arrival today, the space station will have a total of 11 crew members, fitting Crew 11 crew members aboard for just a few days. Part of those 11 crew members include the Crew 10 cadre of NASA astronauts, including Anne McClain. Nicole Ayres, who we mentioned earlier, will be part of the hatch opening procedures. JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov.
Yeah, the Crew 10 astronauts will bring the new arrivals up to speed on everything happening aboard the space station, from emergency procedures to ongoing research. When NASA and SpaceX teams determine weather is ideal for splashdown, the members of Crew 10 will board their Dragon, named Endurance, and return back down to Earth.
Now, direct handovers between crew allow for the continuity of these activities and help to ensure a continuous U.S. presence on the International Space Station, and that's been that for nearly a quarter of a decade. And celebrating the 25th anniversary of continuous human presence in November, I know that was something that program manager for the International Space Station, Dana Weigel, incredibly proud of, talked about it after the post-launch today and in a lot of the media breakout sessions, and a lot to look forward to. This will be the crew on board when that anniversary comes around. And in the fall, NASA astronaut Chris Williams and Roscosmos cosmonaut Sergei Kotsverchkov, as well as Sergei Mikhaev, will join the crew on orbit. And shortly after that, we'll have the departure of the Soyuz MS-27, and that's what we were talking about earlier with NASA astronaut Johnny Kim coming home, and that will mark the commencement of Expedition 74. Now, as we continue to follow along with Dragon's procedures to the International Space Station, now 5.6 kilometers away and closing in at a rate about 4.6 meters per second. While we wait for our next milestone, let's take a moment to meet our crew. NASA astronaut Zena Cardman is your Crew 11 commander. Selected as a NASA astronaut in 2017, Crew 11 is her first spaceflight. The Williamsburg, Virginia native holds a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's degree in marine sciences from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At the time of her astronaut selection, she was pursuing a doctorate in geosciences, and Cardman's geobiology and geochemical cycling research focused on subsurface environments from caves to deep sea sediments. Since completing initial training, Cardman has supported the real-time station operations and lunar surface exploration planning. So she's used to working and studying in environments that are harsh and isolating.
Now, the pilot for Crew 11 is NASA astronaut Mike Fink. This is Fink's fourth trip to the space station, having logged 382 days in space and 9 spacewalks during Expedition 9 in 2004, Expedition 18 in 2008, and STS-134 in 2011, the final flight of the Space Shuttle Endeavour. Throughout the past decade, Fink has applied his expertise to NASA's Commercial Crew program, advancing the development and testing of Dragon and Boeing's Starliner spacecraft towards operational certification. The Emsworth, Pennsylvania native is a graduate of the United States Air Force Test Pilot School and holds a bachelor's degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Cambridge, in both aeronautics and astronautics, as well as Earth, atmospheric, and planetary sciences. He also has a master's degree in aeronautics and astronautics from Stanford University in California. Fink is a retired U.S. Air Force colonel with more than 2,000 flight hours in over 30 different aircraft.
And it is a special trip, this Crew 11, for Mike Fink, just because of what he's been able to accomplish with Space Shuttle Endeavour, the final mission there,
right,
and then moving on over to Dragon Endeavour for today's flight. Well, now moving on to Kimi Yui with 142 days in space. This mission is his second trip to the International Space Station after his selection as a JAXA astronaut, in 2009. Yui flew as a flight engineer for Expedition 44 and then Expedition 45 and became the first Japanese astronaut to capture JAXA's H-2 transfer vehicle using the station's robotic arm. In addition to constructing a new experimental environment aboard Kibo, the Japanese experiment module, he conducted a total of 21 experiments for JAXA. In November 2016, Yui was assigned as the chief of the JAXA astronaut group.
And last but not least is mission specialist and Roscosmonaut Oleg Platonov. This mission is his first spaceflight. Before his selection as a cosmonaut in 2018, Platonov earned a degree in engineering from Krasnodar Air Force Academy in aircraft operations and air traffic management. Assigned a test cosmonaut in 2021, he has experience in piloting aircraft, zero-gravity training, scuba diving, and wilderness survival.
So now we continue to follow along with the path of Crew 11 as they recently completed the approach initiation burn, and everything went swimmingly for that burn. Everything nominal. The crew suited and seated, ready to continue their process. Now the next milestone is going to be Waypoint 0, which we still have a little ways away. The crew about 4.7 kilometers away. Waypoint 0, that's the 400-meter mark for Dragon. So still some time, but anticipation continuing to build up as, again, the crew both aboard Dragon Endeavour and aboard the International Space Station, anxious to have hugs and handshakes here in the next little while.
Yeah, we showed that graphic earlier with all those very close maneuvers as the Dragon spacecraft approaches the International Space Station. Every single one of these maneuvers is very slight and steady. But what I think is really cool is, like, we're getting, 400 meters away from the space station, but they're both moving at about 17,500 miles per hour. But speed is relative, so when you see them next to each other, it doesn't look that fast. They are flying very quickly.
And I've heard a lot of astronauts in this process, they say slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So as methodical as it can be for the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft to make and inch its way, what we see on the screen, you're absolutely right. And to see them moving as quickly as they do, a lot can happen in a short amount of time. Well, we know that everybody is suited and seated, and again, we're continuing to track along as the Dragon spacecraft now 4.4 kilometers away from the International Space Station and continuing to close in on a range of about 4.2 meters per second. Well, they're continuing to track each other. Last time we checked in with where the International Space Station was, it was crossing over the Pacific Ocean, heading towards the east coast of the more southern region of South America. So as they continue that cat and mouse game of trying to find each other along the way, let's take a look at that crew that you have here on the ground supporting today's mission. Now, that's a great live shot of where we are here in Hawthorne, California, and that's where all the positions actively monitoring all the systems on the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft. And we also have all the teams that are in NASA's Johnson Space Center doing likewise from the International Space Station perspective. And Jesse, that's where we're going to pretty soon hear a lot of communications on what they call the big loop, where we're going to get both vehicles, International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft, along with the teams here in Hawthorne and the teams here in Houston, all synced up on a single line of communication so that everyone has open dialogue and open communication as we get further and further in the docking process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's multiple teams that are going to be monitoring the crew throughout their journey. We have the launch team this morning. We have this crew in mission control right now, Hawthorne, monitoring the crew all the way as it gets to the International Space Station. And then we'll transfer over to Houston, monitoring the crew while they're on the station. So there is that overlap period where both teams need to be working in tandem with each other. And we're about to experience that very shortly.
And we're continuing to track for an approximately a contact of about 11:26 p.m. Pacific time. And that's what we're tracking right now. And that would be about 2:26 a.m. Eastern for that initial soft capture between the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft and the International.
4.010.
SpaceX copies on the big loop, 4.010 complete.
And that's great communication there between, again, the teams here on the ground and the crew up aboard. It's been a little bit quiet, but we know it's going to pick up as they get closer and closer. And again, we talked about the big loop that we're going to be here monitoring. And again, the teams in Houston keeping a close eye on that as well. But again, we were tracking right now at approximately 11:26 p.m. Pacific time at 2:26 a.m. Eastern time for that soft capture and initial contact between Dragon Endeavour and the International Space Station. Approach initiation burn came and went well. Now we're looking to approach Waypoint 0, that 400-meter mark. And again, Dragon now inside 4 kilometers away. Now 3.8 is what we're tracking and starting to slow down a little bit, about 3.9 meters per second rate of closure. So they're getting closer and closer, Jesse. Yeah,
it's going to be a slow and steady approach as always, but there's going to be a lot of events happening. We're going to hear a lot of comms, as Joseph mentioned. We're going to hear the call-outs as they get from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1, Waypoint 2, and then all the activity as the spacecraft approaches the International Space Station.
So as we mentioned, that there's a lot of teams involved, including NASA's Johnson Space Center and the International Space Station Flight Control Room. And that's where I'd like to welcome another member of our broadcast team here today and a good colleague of mine, Sandra Jones. Sandra, how are things looking in Houston?
Hey, good morning, and welcome to the International Space Station Flight Control Room at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. We are gearing up for this morning's docking and looking forward to...
SpaceX on the big loop. You are go to begin suit leak check procedure 4.011 when ready.
Activating 4.011. We are go.
And those communications just now between the ground and up to the commander of Dragon, that is Zena Cardman. They are going to begin working through some suit leak checks at this point, as they are now suited up in their spacesuits. But again, we are looking forward to welcoming Crew 11 on board the space station soon. Dragon's approach will be monitored both on the ground and from the space station's cupola, using special software to track Dragon's approach and make sure it stays in the expected zones. Once Dragon is docked, NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers will be primed to start hatch opening operations, and they will start by opening the large hatch on Node 2 Zenith, or the space-facing port, which will give them access into the pressurized mating adapter. The crew will then pressurize the vestibule, which is a small space between the hatches on the Dragon and space station. This area was previously exposed to vacuum prior to docking, so the crew will need to fill it with air and make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressure on Dragon and the space station. Ayers will then use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the space station's vestibule. Flight controllers here in Houston will monitor and verify the pressure readings to make sure that everything is leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. NASA Flight Director Ronak Davey is the mission control director for today's approach and docking, and to their right is their Capcom, or capsule communicator, who will be communicating with the crew aboard the space station. There are currently 7 astronauts aboard the International Space Station, and as we've discussed, that number will jump up to 11 once Crew 11 astronauts arrive on board. And as we continue to hear those communications as the crew is going to begin working through their leak checks, we're excited to get our Crew 11 astronauts aboard to work on handover.
SpaceX on the big loop, you are go to initiate suit leak check.
Okay, go.
So with that, the International Space Station team is ready for docking this morning. That's the latest from here in Mission Control Houston. I'm going to toss it back over to Hawthorne to continue to walk you through the next steps this morning ahead of docking.
Thanks, Sandra. Now coming up, once Dragon arrives at 400 meters below station, it will be at what is known as Waypoint 0. That will be the first checkpoint during our approach, and you can kind of see these movements here on your screen on the graphic. The vehicle can hold here at 400 meters, but if all systems check out, Dragon can just continue its approach to Waypoint 1.
Dragon's move from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1 will swing it up and over top of the International Space Station, arriving at a distance of approximately 220 meters. At this point, it will be what is called the docking axis, which is essentially means directly in front of the docking port. The crew are headed to the zenith port of the International Space Station, or the space-facing port, the Node 2 of the International Space Station. Dragon has docked to Node 2, also known as Harmony, for all of those crewed missions so far, because that's where both the international docking adapters are located.
And once Dragon is only 20 meters away at Waypoint 2, the spacecraft focuses on aligning its docking system with the International Docking Adapter. And again, we may hear a call out called CHOP, which stands for Crew Hands Off Point. This is a little less than 30 seconds before docking, and this means that at this point, any aborts will have to be done automatically by Dragon, hence the hands off.
And the grand arrival, when our crew arrives at the International Space Station, Dragon will fly in and make contact with the IDA, or the International Docking Adapter, giving us what we call a soft capture. That soft capture ring then retracts until the sensors indicate it's time for the 12 hooks to drive in place to give us a hard capture and firmly secure Dragon into its new home on the International Space Station. The crew, namely NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, who you heard from Sandra just a moment ago, will begin to manually pressurize the vestibule and the area between the Dragon hatch and the station hatch. Meanwhile, umbilicals that provide the power, audio, and data connections from the station to Dragon are put in place. Then it's time for leak checks and the hatch opening, which is currently timelined to come more than 2 hours or so following the docking.
Yes, but I'm sure Crew 11 is getting excited as they know that they're actually hovering around the International Space Station. We just have some maneuvers that we need to do still to make sure that they can align with the docking adapter and dock safely today.
And right now, Dragon currently 2.5 kilometers away from the International.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop. We see 4 good suit leak checks.
Dragon copies on the big loop. We see the same.
And the big loop communications continuing as the crew in their suits and doing those suit checks again. Time for the leak checks and hatch openings, which we'll see a little bit later on, but all part of those safety procedures put in place for not only for the spacecraft, but eventually on to docking and before we can open up the hatch and have those handshakes and hugs. Now, we mentioned earlier that this is the same Crew 11 team that's going to be on board the International Space Station for its 25th anniversary of continuous human presence, and they're going to join what's already 7 crew members on board the International Space Station of Expedition 73, including Crew 10 and Soyuz MS-27. Now, the members of Crew 10, they launched back in March 12th, in fact, of 2025, and they have been up there for a little while, led by NASA astronaut and commander of the crew, Anne McClain, first-time flyer, and NASA for the pilot of Crew 10, Nicole Ayers, Takuya Onishi of JAXA, and Kirill Peskov of Roscosmos. And also Johnny Kim, the NASA astronaut, a part of the Soyuz MS-27 crew that launched back in early April with Sergei Ryzhikov and Alexei Zubritsky. So for Zina Cardman, Mike Fink, Kimi Yui, and Oleg Platonov, excited for that reunion. And in fact, Zina Cardman, NASA classmates, a part of the Turtles class with Johnny Kim. So I know they're excited to catch up with each other as well. Kimi Yui onboarded and became an astronaut along with Takuya Onishi. And for Yui, that's his best friend. He's actually looking forward to going and reuniting with his best friend. And it's been a little while, about 4 years since the last time there were 2 JAXA astronauts on the International Space Station together. So impressive there. And then for Oleg Platonov, reuniting with his Roscosmos cosmonaut crew as well. So a lot of reuniting, a lot of happiness that'll be coming from this crew. But to be a part of this expedition and then also be the crew on board for 25 years of continuous human presence, all kinds of milestones to celebrate.
Yeah, that's probably pretty exciting to go and meet your best friend in space. I think that's really cool that we are getting more crew in space, government and commercial crew in space, and maybe one day, that'll be the phone call you make, like, hey, I'll meet you in space.
And to that effect, too, just because of where they're docking today, again, that Zenith port, the space-facing port of the Harmony module, that was recently vacated just a couple of weeks ago from Axiom Mission 4, the 4th private astronaut to the International Space Station. So a lot of comings and goings and a lot of people on board station at any given point. But for them to come around and for the Dragon Endeavour celebrating its own milestones, its 6th flight and its return to the International Space Station again after 5 years ago to this day, it was the splashdown and return of Demo 2. And there's some great views that we're now getting. And this is from Dragon looking to the International Space Station, that sun shining bright, reflecting off of it and bouncing back towards the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft.
That is a view to see as your destination that you are making your way towards. As Dragon approaches the International Space Station, that view should get clearer and clearer, larger and larger right now. And there's a view inside of Dragon where we can see the commander and pilot of Crew 11. Again, this is an autonomous vehicle, so they really are just monitoring. You could see them utilizing those display screens there in front of them. And they're just monitoring all the operations that are happening on Dragon as they approach. This helps them stay aware. They do have to stay inside of their seats, so they can't look out the window very much. Very hard to see where Dragon actually is in comparison to the International Space Station. So those displays actually help them understand what's happening, where is Dragon, how close is it to the International Space Station, so that they can monitor and understand what's happening when they hear different sounds of the thrusters firing as Dragon is maneuvering its way towards the station.
And if necessary, there can be mid-course maneuvering after the approach initiation burn, which has already happened. And we just got note that there will be some more fine-tuning of the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft. And there you're seeing the over-the-shoulder shots as Mike Fink and Zina Cardman. Those are the 2 in the middle of the capsule. Platonov and Yui are on either side of them, but they're the ones talking over. And as you said, Jesse, monitoring what's soon to be in about a minute and a half to a minute or so of what's going to be that fine-tuning burn to make sure that Dragon is fine-tuning its path and on the right approach. You can see the great numbers down there at the bottom of your screen, too, of how close Dragon is getting to the International Space Station. And there's the space station from Dragon once again, as they are 13 hours and 30 minutes into today's flight. Their flight from liftoff, which was earlier this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern, 8:43 a.m. Pacific time. So it's been a event-filled day for this Crew 11 team. Had they lifted off on the first attempt yesterday, it would have been a lot longer of a phasing, about 39 hours or so, a chance to get settled in. And there's a great view from the International Space Station on the right side, looking down at Dragon. So they're inching their way slowly but surely as we continue to monitor the progress of the Dragon spacecraft. But again, we did catch word that there will be an out-of-plane burn, an adjustment burn to follow up, so they continue that fine-tuning process and make their way to the International Space Station.
And some great views here on the left-hand side inside of Dragon with the crew on your right-hand side, again, from the International Space Station, looking at Dragon as it approached. And in the bottom right-hand of your corner, you could see the graphic showing the thrusters on Dragon, which I think is really cool. It's a live graphic of every thruster that is thrusting, essentially. And I think it's so cool because, you know, they're firing at different moments. There's a lot of tweaking that needs to happen. So there's several different thrusters firing at all different times to make sure that Dragon is oriented exactly the way that it needs to make its way as it approaches closer and closer to the International Space Station.
And Jesse, just to the right of that graphic you're seeing is those thrusters continuing to fire. And again, this is the maneuver, the mid-course burn that they're attempting and pushing Dragon to continue to properly align itself on the right trajectory to the International Space Station. But that's the International Docking Adapter that'll come into play a little bit later on. We've talked about the hooks needing to drive and hook to, after the soft capture, create the hard mate and bring Dragon even closer to the International Space Station before the leak checks can occur, the hatch opening, the pressurization, and so forth. So some great views on that screen. And again, as the spacecraft continuing to make its way closer and closer to the International Space Station, now about 1.5 kilometers away and closing in at a good rate as well of about 2 meters per second, as both Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station now covering over the southernmost portions of Africa.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, mid-course maneuver complete, performance nominal. Trajectory has converged on waypoint 0.
Dragon copies. Great news.
Great news indeed. That mid-course maneuver burn is complete. That was where we were seeing all those thrusters firing. Again, an adjustment needed as the vehicle approaches the International Space Station. There are very particular planned burns, and sometimes we add in additional potential burns that are only used if needed, and we did use this mid-course burn for this coasting phase for the Crew 11 crew. And you could see on your left-hand screen, well, there was a map of where Dragon and the International Space Station were located around the globe, but this is a great view from the International Space Station, looking at Dragon. As you can see with Earth in the background, Dragon is still below the International Space Station. It'll soon move its way to Waypoint 1, which will swing it up and above the International Space Station.
And those views,
really
again,
cool
coming
views.
from the orbiting laboratory, but and absolutely stellar. And that's the Cronus position inside of NASA's Johnson Space Center and Mission Control, providing these great views that allow us to follow along with Dragon's trajectory and procedures. But going back to a successful mid-course maneuver and helping out with that AI burn too, Jesse, that's just one of several opportunities where you can fine-tune and have those gates, those checkpoints, because now we're tracking what will be soon the next big milestone, reaching Waypoint 0, that 400-meter mark, before Dragon will continue its approach. And they can hold at that Waypoint 0, but if everything is aligned properly, sometimes we've seen the Dragon spacecraft continue to move forward. The crews on the ground both agree that everything looks great and we can continue to push forward, but just that's why we have those gates, to make sure that everything is properly aligned before we get any closer.
And also on the bottom left-hand of your screen, you could see a couple dials there. We have the range and the rate. The range is the distance from the International Space Station, and the rate is how quickly it's moving towards the International Space Station. So again, live range and rate there that you can follow along as Dragon makes its way to the International Space Station.
So 1.2 kilometers away is all that separates the two vehicles right now. And on the left-hand side, again, those over-the-shoulder shots of Mike Fink and Zena Carbon looking over those trajectory. And there's Dragon looking up at the International Space Station, and there's the space station looking down at Dragon Endeavour. Now, again, they're going to be performing all these different gates that we've been talking about. Waypoint 0 is the next one, where they're going to reach the 400-meter mark from there. Waypoint 1 and Waypoint 2. Now, part of that will also have them go up and over top of the International Space Station, because again, they're going to catch up to the space station from below, swing out in front, and then over to the zenith port, or the space-facing side of the International Space Station to docking. So still quite a bit of movement left for the spacecraft to accomplish.
Again, as we've been mentioning, the crew is in their seats. The commander and pilot are both monitoring using those displays that are right in front of them. Again, just monitoring. Dragon is an autonomous vehicle, so essentially on autopilot as they make their way to station. And I love this view of the International Space Station. You know, you see pictures and sometimes models of the International Space Station, but when you get to see it live, like a live view like this, it is so cool to know that that is flying above the Earth at all times, and you get to see it a little bit up close. Even though we're down here on Earth, we get to see it live on these views.
Especially as we get closer, all the hardware up close from the solar arrays you can see fanned out on either side. As we now just got word that there's going to be a go, no-go poll for whether or not the Dragon spacecraft can proceed past Waypoint 0 or if they need to hold at that given point. So that's where everything will continue to be monitored from the teams on the ground as well as the teams inside the International Space Station and the Dragon spacecraft. The big loop, you've heard it when they call up, they say Dragon on the big loop. That's what they mean, the communications that everyone is a part of, whether it's here in Hawthorne, in Houston, on the International Space Station, or inside Dragon Endeavour. And they've also just crossed the 1,000-kilometer mark, or 1,000-meter mark, 1 kilometer, if you will, and that brings them into the approach ellipsoid. So that's how close we are, and those milestones we're starting to reach for the spacecraft. So now approaching about 920 meters away, and there's that rate of closure, that 4.9 meters per second for Dragon Endeavour, is Zena Carbon and Mike Fink continuing to look over their screens and see the trajectory. And you can see it a little bit on that middle screen there where the orb kind of on that top portion, that's where the International Space Station is. And you can see some of those lines, those pathways being drawn. That's where the Dragon spacecraft is looking to maneuver. You can see it even swing up and over to the left and kind of curve up and over top. So it's fun to see what the astronauts are seeing as they continue their procedure and stair-stepping to the orbiting laboratory.
And there you can see, this is a graphic of what Joseph was just mentioning. When they reach that waypoint 0 point on the graphic, again, the vehicle will move towards waypoint 1, which will swing up and over the International Space Station. This graphic is showing the Dragon spacecraft when it's below the station, moving from Earth towards the station. It's going to swing up and around, and again, on the space-facing side of the International Space Station, there's a better view of that. So it's going to take that path up to waypoint 1 and then begin to approach, first align itself with the docking adapter that arrow is pointing to at waypoint 2, and then that where it says contact is where that IDA, or International Docking Adapter, is, and that's where Dragon is going to dock and have its home for the next few months for Crew 11.
And we're still tracking that docking time, that soft capture time, at around about 11:26 p.m. Pacific, 2:26 a.m. Eastern time. And of course, as we continue to make our way towards the next milestone, that is Waypoint 0 that we're talking about, we're going to get word of that go, no-go poll for the teams on the ground and how they wish for the spacecraft to continue to proceed. And there you get another great look again as coming down from the International Space Station, looking at the Dragon spacecraft. And you see that strobe light blinking, especially when you're in an orbital nighttime. It's helpful because that helps bring a shine of light literally on the International Space Station to help fine-tune some of those trajectory adjustments if necessary.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Ground is go for approach 0. Burn is enabled. Maneuver start time, 5:35 Zulu. As a reminder, Dragon will nominally continue approach through waypoint 1 toward waypoint 2 without stopping at waypoint 1.
Dragon copies. We see the approach leg enabled flag is true. This will initiate at 0535 Zulu. Dragon will not stop at waypoint 1.
Communications there between the ground and the crew aboard Dragon Endeavour in NASA SpaceX Crew 11, and the confirmation from Commander Zena Cardman on that go, no-go poll for Waypoint 0. As they continue to close in, that waypoint will be reached at the 400-meter mark, so still a little ways to go. Bottom left-hand side, you can see how close they are, 700 and now 8 meters away from the International Space Station. Well, this crew is going to be on board, Jesse, as you mentioned, for a good several months, and they're going to be participating in a lot of technology demonstrations, outreach activities, but also a lot of human research and performance. And one of the science experiments and research activations that they're going to dive into is right interwoven with the Artemis campaign, and that is simulated lunar landings that they'll be participating in microgravity, because again, that's the International Space Station, a unique perspective to accomplish a lot of these research. And select crew members will participate in this series of simulated moon landings before, during, and after their flight, and they're going to use handheld controllers to help over multiple screens, and they will fly through simulated scenarios created to resemble the lunar South Pole region that the Artemis crews plan to visit. And this experience will allow researchers to evaluate how different gravitational forces may disorient astronauts and affect their ability to pilot a spacecraft like a lunar lander. So that's a great way of using the International Space Station and that unique microgravity environment to advance NASA and the world's objectives of moving and returning to the moon and beyond.
Yeah, that is such an exciting mission to look forward to. It's been so long since we've been to the moon, and it's so exciting to know that even though we haven't been to the moon in years, we have been working towards going back to the moon and staying longer on the moon, which I think is going to be great. And this is why we do a lot of this research that's happening, like Joseph said, on the International Space Station.
So now 630 meters away. Now, inside of that is the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft continues its climb to catch up to the International Space Station. And that's just one of many research items, Jesse, that the crew will be participating in. Another one is learning more about the spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or we call it SANS for short. And that study will investigate fluid pressure on the brain while they examine how the body processes B vitamins and whether supplements can help astronauts respond to bodily fluid shifts. Because in microgravity, like here on Earth, you have the gravity kind of keeping your body fluids in check and everything able to cycle appropriately. But in microgravity, that can shift, and participating crew members will test whether a daily B vitamin supplement can eliminate or ease symptoms of that SANS. And specific crew members will also wear thigh cuffs to help keep bodily fluids from traveling to the head. So it'll be interesting to see what results come of that, because again, all this being able to accomplish in that unique microgravity environment of the International Space Station to benefit future long-duration missions.
Yeah, and you know, some of these research experiments that are happening in space sometimes end up coming up with new ideas and new information that actually help us here on Earth. There's a lot of things that have come out of the research that NASA's done on the International Space Station that helps us with our daily lives here.
Now inside 570 meters away for NASA SpaceX Crew 11, as we have a transfer in communications there, and that's what was providing the live views from the International Space Station as they switch from different signals, different satellites to provide that data and the video feeds, again, coming from the Cronus team down at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. But there's the team here in Hawthorne that continues to monitor the pathways for the Dragon spacecraft and Endeavour, and everything continuing to move along path as we get closer and closer to Waypoint 0. And again, still tracking that docking time. That'll be coming up a little bit later on here this evening on the West Coast, early morning on the East Coast, as Crew 11 anxious to get to the International Space Station.
Yeah, we're just under an hour away from that docking time. Still have a few maneuvers to do before they dock with the International Space Station. But it's a nice, smooth journey for them so far. Again, launching this morning, and just about 15 hours on their coasting to the International Space Station so far. Just about 1 hour left.
And that's what you're seeing right there in the bottom of your screen there, the T+. That's 13 hours, 45 minutes, and now 40 some odd seconds since they launched earlier this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern time, as we're now getting those views back as they were able to reconnect all the communications there. There's the Dragon spacecraft looking at a wonderful rendition and wonderful resolution of the International Space Station right there. And you can even see a Dragon spacecraft that is for Crew 10 right there on the topmost portion of the International Space Station. And that is the Dragon Endurance that took Crew 10 back to the orbiting lab back in March.
Yeah, again, I love this view. Just for perspective, the International Space Station is about the size of a football field. So with that in mind, you can kind of see how far Dragon is from the International Space Station so far. But as it gets closer, you can see how large the International Space Station really is.
We're about 5 minutes away from reaching Waypoint 0 as we're closing in about 100 meters in terms of distance until we reach that 400-meter mark, and that's where Waypoint 0 is to begin the first of what is going to be 3 gates or 3 checkpoints for the Dragon spacecraft to reach: Waypoint 0, Waypoint 1, and Waypoint 2.
Again, this view is Dragon looking up at the International Space Station, still below the space station, but again, as it swings to Waypoint 1, it's going to swing up and over the International Space Station. It'll basically be between the International Space Station and the rest of space.
We're still a few minutes away from reaching that Waypoint 0 part, but it's good to see that gap continuing to close as, again, over-the-shoulder looks of NASA astronauts and Commander Zena Cardman on the left-hand side there, and that's Colonel Mike Fink, the pilot of the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft, on the right. And you can see similar views of what we were just looking at from the viewpoint of Dragon up to the International Space Station for Mike Fink and Zena Cardman. The screens on the far left and right-hand side. You can see the that viewpoint that they're looking at as well, and then all the telemetry data right there in the middle. You can see Dragon slowly but surely, a small dot making its way up at the bottom portion to that circle up towards the top of the screen. That is the International Space Station. And you can also see, Jesse, it's starting to slow down a little bit, that rate of closure. They were humming along for a little while there with all the key burns that they had to go through, especially those shortly after liftoff, but they're going to start making that slow and methodical approach towards that space-facing port of the International Space Station, but right now still below the orbiting lab and looking to swing up and over top of it here in the next little while. Now approaching 460 meters away, and again tracking for that docking time of approximately 11:26 a.m. Pacific, p.m. Pacific, 2:26 a.m. Eastern time on what's been a full day of activities for Crew 11 after launching earlier this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern. About a 16-hour and some change phasing, but they're arriving a little bit ahead of schedule at the moment, so anxious to get there.
And Waypoint 0, again, is about 400 meters away from the space station. So if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, that range dial there, that is showing how close the vehicle, or the distance the vehicle is from the International Space Station. About 50 more meters to go to get to Waypoint 0.
2.5 minutes is what they're estimating right now to get to that Waypoint 0 mark, and we'll continue to hear communications from the big loop. That's the Dragon International Space Station, teams here in SpaceX in Hawthorne, and the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, all communicating together as they continue to advance to that Waypoint 0 milestone.
And if you're just joining us, you are watching Crew 11's approach to the International Space Station. Looks like we did lose those live views, but what you're seeing on your screen is a view of Mission Control here in Hawthorne, California. These are the members of the SpaceX team monitoring Dragon and the crew all the way through their journey to the International Space Station.
And those views continue to come and go, and that's perfectly normal. That's the communication shifting between different points of contact for the vehicles as they continue to orbit around the Earth, 17,500 miles an hour. You have to kind of pinpoint those communications. So there's little acquisitions of signal, AOS that you sometimes hear, or loss of signal, LOS, that you sometimes hear. So there's a great view of the teams inside of the SpaceX Mission Control here in Hawthorne as we await the acquisition of signal for both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station to continue to bring those views. But right now we're coming up on about a minute away from reaching that Waypoint 0 mark, and that's where those first of 3 gates will occur. So far, recapping what's happened, we mentioned that the launch was earlier this morning for NASA SpaceX Crew 11, and then shortly after launch, they would begin a sequence of burns, Jesse, that they would need to accomplish to stair-step their way, climb up higher, to connect and eventually catch up to the International Space Station, which they are still doing so today, and they have done so swimmingly. Everything has been going as planned for the teams and monitoring those up on the Dragon spacecraft, International Space Station, and here on the ground. And that's where it kind of puts us where we are today, is they're starting to make that 400-meter mark away and ever so slowly making it closer and closer.
And again, we are approaching Waypoint 0. We were just about 50 meters away when we lost that live view. But here's that graphic again to show you where Dragon currently is. Again, Waypoint 0 is just 400 meters from the International Space Station. Once we reach Waypoint 0, the vehicle is going to swing itself up and over the International Space Station. So this view of this graphic here showing Dragon below, basically between Earth and the International Space Station. And so to make its way from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1, it will be swinging around the space station. Here's that graphic there, up to Waypoint 1, which will be between the space station and space. And then it'll align itself with that docking adapter and then make its way to dock with the International Space Station. It'll pass through Waypoint 2, which is about 20 meters from the space station. Again, these are just checkpoints to make sure that the vehicle is healthy, that the International Space Station is ready for them to continue their approach, and then it'll eventually do a soft capture with the IDA and then a hard capture with 12 hard hooks that will safe the vehicle to the International Space Station for its home for the next few months.
And I love that graphic, too, because it illustrates the milestones and distance, too. Not only we say Waypoint 0, Waypoint 1, Waypoint 2, what does that mean? Well, we said 400 meters. That's Waypoint 0. When you get to Waypoint 1, as you mentioned, Jesse, it goes up over top. It'll be 220 meters away, and then it'll continue to approach to the 20-meter mark.
Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to ground. Approach 0 has started, and the trajectory has converged on Waypoint 1. Expect arrival at Waypoint 1 at 6:10 Zulu.
Dragon copies, expecting Waypoint 1, 610 Zulu. Dragon to ground.
So with those communications, you just heard that the Dragon spacecraft has reached Waypoint 0, which means it is 400 meters directly below the station. And that's what we've been following along. And we can see it in the views coming here shortly once we receive those communications and connections back from the spacecraft and the International Space Station. Now coming up, Dragon's move from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1. As we've talked about, we'll swing it up over top of the International Space Station, and it'll then pause for a few moments and align itself at the 220-meter mark. And at this point, it'll be on what we call the docking axis, which is essentially, it means it's directly in front of the docking port, which today it's going to the zenith port, the space-facing port of the International Space Station, one of the two on that front side. There's the forward-facing, but we saw in great images earlier, that is where the Crew 10 Dragon currently resides. So that's where and why the Dragon spacecraft is going up to the space-facing port. So we're already hearing teams on the ground continuing to talk, and we'll hear more polls for going or go no-goes as everything continues to remain on track for Crew 11 and their approach to the International Space Station.
Yeah, we're just around about 30 minutes or so away from Dragon making its way to that Waypoint 1 location. Again, these are slow and steady moves. As we saw when we did have live views, it looked really slow as it was approaching. But again, just a reminder, both spacecraft are flying at 17,500 miles per hour, which is pretty fast.
And that docking port, again, was just recently vacated a couple of weeks ago from Axiom mission for the 4th private astronaut mission. to the International Space Station that saw former NASA astronaut Peggy Whitson and her crew that had representatives for the first time coming to the International Space Station from India, Poland, and Hungary. So it's certainly a milestone mission there, but they recently had departed, splashed down off the West Coast, the second West Coast splashdown for a SpaceX Dragon. Crew 10 will be the first NASA crew to do so, but again, that's where the home will be for Crew 11 here in the next little while as we get those great views back. 410 meters is where they currently reside, and at Waypoint 0, and we are now approaching the 14-hour mark of today's journey for the Crew 11 crew.
And love that we get these live views. Again, this is the Crew 11 crew looking up at the International Space Station. The vehicle's still between Earth and the space station. And again, it's swinging to Waypoint 1, where it will be between the space station and space on the space-facing side, which is where it's going to dock today in under an hour from now.
Now, this is the 6th flight of Dragon Endeavour that Crew 11 is on board right now. We've talked about the milestones, that today is the 5th anniversary of the return of the Demo 2 crew with Bob and Doug, but this also supported, the spacecraft also supported Crew 2. We talked about Axiom Mission 4. This spacecraft supported the first private astronaut mission, Axiom Mission 1, Crew 6, and Crew 8. So a great history, as this is, again, the first flight of this particular Dragon and the first Dragon spacecraft to have 6 flights under its belt.
Yeah, the flight leader of the 5 Dragon spacecraft that we have in operation, carrying crew to and from the International Space Station out into space. Just pretty incredible how far reusability has come with spacecraft. The fact that we are on the 6th flight of Dragon is mind-blowing to me.
And we heard from the management teams of all the different programs, Commercial Crew Program, the NASA management, the International Space Station. But SpaceX had their management team on the post-launch press conference today, and they mentioned that this Dragon Endeavour holds the longest duration for a single mission. That was Crew 8, 235 days. And now, when they launched, they were at 700 days, right on the button, cumulative time for Dragon Endeavour. They anticipate that to possibly hit 4 digits at the time of mission completion. So again, an impressive run for this particular spacecraft, carrying NASA astronaut and commander of Crew 11, Zena Cardman, along with pilot and NASA astronaut Mike Fink. And then you have JAXA astronaut Camille Yui and Oleg Platonov of Roscosmos, the crew of 4, again, making its way slowly but surely to the International Space Station.
Yeah, Joseph, you hit a lot of milestones that Endeavour has been accomplishing. And again, reusability for SpaceX is key. It's basically our whole mission. This is how you bring the cost of space down, and being able to fly over and over again using the same vehicle is just incredible. And to be a part of these missions and watch this happen in real life is so cool.
And we mentioned earlier in the broadcast that there are crew aboard the International Space Station that are helping, currently activating and helping out with the docking procedures for today, and that's namely NASA astronaut Johnny Kim and NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers. For Kim, he is located in the cupola, the window to the world. You've seen a lot of phenomenal imagery coming from now nearly 25 years of the International Space Station and continuous human presence from those great views. Well, he's using special equipment to monitor Dragon's approach to the International Space Station. And then Nicole Ayers will be on tap to help out with the hatch opening procedure. She did likewise for the Axiom Mission 4 team, so she has that experience to go, as ready to welcome in 2 of her own from NASA, and again, JAXA and Roscosmos astronaut and cosmonaut in tow as well. So again, it'll be a full day. I know this crew on board the Dragon, as well as the crew on the station, will be happy to see each other. They'll wind things down, but then they'll also begin handover procedures, which are going to get underway, about 3 days worth of full handover procedures, starting what I imagine be right tomorrow. They'll get familiarized with the station, go over safety protocols, and ultimately get themselves settled in and situated, because on the horizon will be the return of Crew 10.
And if you look in your right bottom corner, again, you can see a graphic of the Dragon spacecraft with the locations of its thrusters. And you can see the thrusters are firing one at a time. Again, it's moving from Waypoint 0 to Waypoint 1, and it's flying autonomously, so the thrusters are firing exactly what it needs to continue to adjust to make its way to that Waypoint 1 location. I think that's so cool that you could see that live there. We don't always get views of the Dragon spacecraft where you can see the thruster. Sometimes we do, but this graphic allows you to see it in real time, which is awesome.
And we're about 26 minutes away from reaching that Waypoint 1 mark, and about 15 minutes away from the next go, no-go poll. Again, these are all part of the systems and safety checkouts to make sure that Dragon is performing as it should. The International Space Station is ready to receive the spacecraft as well, as you continue to see those great views and those solar arrays reflecting the sunlight perfectly as the spacecraft continuing to move. And you see some slight adjustments in thruster firings happening in that bottom right-hand side when they illuminate from the black to white. That's helping illustrate, again, some of those fine tunings that need to happen for a spacecraft to properly align itself up with its ultimate destination. So to recap what we've been seeing so far here this evening, and what has been now just inside of the 14-hour mark of today's flight, earlier this morning, Crew 11, NASA SpaceX Crew 11, would launch from the Kennedy Space Center off the Florida coast at 11:43 a.m. Eastern time and begin what was about a 16-hour journey, and still counting down to about 2 more hours or so to if they might match up. Now, they did get a little bit ahead of schedule, but ultimately a shorter time period than their first launch attempt, which would have had them on about a 39-hour phasing, but ultimately a busy day from launch to the anticipated docking time, which we're still tracking to be around 11:26 p.m. Pacific, 2:26 a.m. Eastern time. And as we mentioned earlier, we're a few more minutes away from the Waypoint 1 milestone, which will be 220 meters away, is all that separates the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. And again, we're going to hear another round of go, no-go polls as the crew on board. You can see again Mike Fink on the right-hand side, Zena Carbon, she is on the left, working through their screens. And again, as you mentioned, Jesse, autonomously Dragon, the ability to dock, but if they do need to take over manual control, they can do so, but certainly following along with every step of their procedures.
This is also a cool view. And of course, we lost the view right when I wanted to point out the spacesuits and the difference between Commander Zena's spacesuit and Mike Fink's spacesuit. When the view comes back, I'll try and point it out. But you could see the differences in the suits and the gloves and the cuffs on the arms. And there you could see those suits. You could see the difference right there just visually from Commander Zena's suit versus Mike Fink on the right. Mike Fink.
SpaceX Dragon to ground. Quick temperature request.
Go ahead, Dragon. With you on Dragon to ground.
Yes, sorry to ask at such a fun moment, but could we have it a little bit cooler in our cabin, please?
We copy the request, and we'll take action on that right now.
Many thanks.
Some comms from the core here in mission control, speaking with the crew. They did a temperature check, and the crew might be getting a little warm. They are in their suits as they patiently wait docking with the International Space Station, and those suits actually help keep them cool. So they actually can control the temperature inside of Dragon as well as through the suits from mission control in Hawthorne, California. And so it sounds like they're going to flow some cooler air to keep the temperature down for the crew.
So now 14 hours and 4 minutes into today's flight, as Crew 11 continuing to make that methodical approach to the International Space Station. We have made its way from Waypoint 0, now looking to get to Waypoint 1 as we continue to follow along with the trajectory of the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft.
This is a slow approach to the International Space Station, but again, we have multiple checkpoints to make sure that the vehicle is safe, the crew is safe, as well as the International Space Station. These checkpoints allow us to just take a moment, check the telemetry, check the health of the vehicles, health of the crew, as they make their approach to dock with the space station. And again, we've already passed through Waypoint 0, making our way to Waypoint 1.
And again, this team, after a busy launch, we mentioned that the launch was earlier this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern Time, had to accomplish a sequence of burns that Dragon needs to perform in order to climb higher up to catch up to the International Space Station. Phase burn, the boost burn, close burn, transfer, and then the final co-elliptic burn, and that's what helps set when Dragon is going to dock to the International Space Station. From there, we did the approach initiation burn, which was right as pretty much the broadcast started here this evening. And from there, we've now made our way to Waypoint 0. There was a slight adjustment between the approach initiation and Waypoint 0 to, again, fine-tune that Dragon path to the orbiting laboratory. And now we await for the arrival to Waypoint 1, which should be coming up here in just a little while now. But again, it's that methodical approach and that fine-tuning, and again, the communications between the teams on the ground that help this process along. And another great view. This time you see the arc of the Earth with the backdrop of the SpaceX Dragon Endeavour spacecraft. That's that little white dot, that little white speck you see against the blackness of space. But again, another impressive view of planet Earth as Dragon continues its approach.
Yeah, and this is a great view to show the difference of where Dragon is relative to Earth and the space station. Earlier, just about 20 minutes ago, when the International Space Station was looking at Dragon, you could see Earth in the background, so you could tell that Dragon was between the Earth and the space station. Now it's kind of almost approaching the side of the International Space Station, not quite there yet, but you could see this is the path that it's taking to move up and over the International Space Station to make it to the space-facing side.
Right now, Dragon and the International Space Station, they're flying off the coast of Japan at the moment as they continue to try and catch up to one another, flying 17,500 miles per hour. And the anticipated docking time for Crew 11 and their arrival to the orbiting laboratory around 11:26 p.m. Pacific time at 2:26 a.m. Eastern time. And that is the Dragon spacecraft right there, that white speck, and a great view from the ground teams and NASA's Johnson Space Center and Mission Control, the International Space Station Flight Control Room, the Cronus position, using those exterior cameras of the International Space Station to provide us with these spectacular views. And actually, when we get a chance, when we get to it, hopefully, we'll take a look at the Crew 11 patch, which has a nice nod to a view like this in the Voyager pale blue dot taken from the Voyager craft. Again, coming up shortly on another go, no-go poll that'll have the Dragon Endeavour continue its journey towards the International Space Station, and from there, Waypoint 1, which will be 220 meters away. Well, as we continue to bring these great views and follow along the path of Dragon Endeavour, we talked about the teams in NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, and the International Space Station Flight Control Room as they continue to monitor the progress of the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft. Let's check back in with Sandra Jones from Mission Control.
Thanks, Joseph. Right now, the crew on board Space Station is awake and preparing for the upcoming docking of Dragon to Space Station. Everything is continuing to look good here on the Space Station side. As we've mentioned, NASA astronaut Johnny Kim will be in the Space Station's cupola using special software to track Dragon's approach and make sure it stays in the expected zones. NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers will also be primed for hatch opening operations once Dragon is docked. During these operations, they'll start by opening the large hatch on Node 2 Zenith, which is that space-facing port, to give them access into the pressurized mating adapter. The crew will then pressurize the vestibule, which is a small space between the hatches on Dragon and the space station. Because this area was exposed to vacuum prior to docking, the crew needs to fill it with air and make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressure on Dragon and the International Space Station. Heirs will use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the station's vestibule. Flight controllers here in Houston will monitor and verify the pressure readings here to make sure that everything is leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. This entire process will take a couple of hours to complete. We are looking forward to docking today, still tracking 1:26 a.m. Central Time, followed by hatch opening about an hour and a half later. We'll round it all out with a welcome ceremony as Crew 11 officially joins the Expedition 73 crew currently aboard the International Space Station. Again, everything continuing to go smoothly from here in Mission Control Houston, so back over to Hawthorne.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And yes, still a lot to come for the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft as they continue that methodical approach. You mentioned Johnny Kim continuing to monitor from the cupola, and Nicole Ayers, who will be on tap for the hatch opening procedures and pressurization checks, those leak checks once soft capture and then hard capture are completed. And then it usually takes about from soft capture and that initial contact to about 2 hours or so between hatch opening and welcoming the crew formally on board. And again, we'll hear all the communications and comms coming from all the teams involved, both here in Hawthorne and in Johnson Space Center and Mission Control. So again, that's a great view of the view from the International Space Station to the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft.
This is a great view from the International Space Station, looking at Dragon as it's making its approach. And the sun is shining bright on Dragon, looking very bright there. We might be able to see some live thrust firings here from this view. There you go.
And I like that you can see the reflection of Dragon in the lens.
Yeah. It's a pretty awesome view. And there we're getting a sharper image. Very clear image of Dragon now. Very telling.
Dragon SpaceX on Dragon to ground for cabin temperature.
SpaceX Dragon to ground. Go ahead.
Ground team just took action to drop our thermal control system loop from the warm configuration to the medium configuration. That should help cool down the cabin temperature a bit for you guys. We're going to continue to keep an eye on it.
All right, Dragon copies. We can feel it's already cooling down a little bit, so we'll be chilling. Thank you.
And that's closing the loop on some communications that we heard from pilot Mike Fink of NASA on board the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft, talking to the crew on the ground, looking to bring that temperature down just a little bit as they are in their suits and continuing that methodical approach to the International Space Station. And that's where this view is coming from. And we've been talking about the Cronus position inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room. That's the Communication Radio Frequency Onboard Network Utilization Specialist. That helps us put together these views. And actually, when you look inside of Mission Control, if you get a chance to visit Johnson Space Center, they are right in front of the Public Affairs Officer, where Sandra Jones is today doing commentary, and they have the access to work closely with the team to provide some of these great views from the International Space Station looking onto the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft. And we also just got word that we're going to be coming up soon on the go, no-go poll for Waypoint 2 as they continue to march closer and closer to Waypoint 1. Again, Waypoint 1 is 220 meters away. Waypoint 2 will bring the spacecraft to just 20 meters away from the International Space Station. We'll hear the results of that go, no-go poll here shortly. And then after those communications, that is when the spacecraft itself will have reached that Waypoint 1 mark.
We are getting closer and closer to seeing Crew 11 dock with the International Space Station, expecting that docking time to happen at 11:26 p.m. Pacific time. And again, really cool views. You could see Dragon getting clearer and clearer and closer to the International Space Station in this view. Again, we've got the dark background. That means that there's space behind Dragon, so it's moving from that waypoint 0, which was between Earth and the International Space Station. Now it's probably closer to being right next to the space station. And in your bottom left-hand corner, you can see the range or the distance from the space station, which is 381 meters from the space station. There's a better view to see a little bit more what that distance looks like as the Dragon spacecraft gets closer and closer to the station.
As these two continue to track down each other, they are currently flying over the North Pacific right now, some 250 plus statute miles above the Earth. And then in the bottom left there, you can see the distance of Dragon from the International Space Station, now 372 meters away, and have slowed down to now a 1 meter per second rate closure as the thrusters firing in that bottom right-hand side of your screen. Again, that fine-tuning necessary to properly align Dragon to be in the exact right space at the right time as we close in on waypoint 1.
Yeah, and with this view, you can tell that Dragon is basically next to the International Space Station, which means that it's about halfway to that waypoint 1 point.
And again, these two vehicles are flying incredibly fast, 17,500 miles an hour. So when you see it in this perspective relative to each other, it looks like it's that slow and steady pace.
Looks like they're not moving.
But again, they're moving so quickly that an orbital daytime and orbital nighttime comes and goes very quickly, so much so about 90 minutes for each. So that's impressive to know how fast they have to move, but also how quickly they have to move to close in on each other to ultimately bring Crew 11 to its destination, the International Space Station, for the next several months.
Yeah, if you really like sunrises and sunsets, being an astronaut is a great job to have because you get about 15, 16 of those every single day.
And that's something that I know Zena Cardman has talked a lot about, is getting spectacular views of photos, and that's a wonderful view from Dragon to the International Space Station. And there you can see that backside of Space Station in shadow as the sun just off to that left-hand side of Earth.
That is such a cool view.
As the Dragon spacecraft now making its way up over top of the International Space Station. That gives you great perspective of where they're heading. That space-facing port, that zenith port of the Harmony modules. So you had them when we originally started, they were just underneath the International Space Station. Then they swung up to be right about in line to where the Crew 10 Dragon is, that forward port. Well, now they have a little bit more ways to go. And there's a great illustration in the middle of that screen there, that Dragon where the line kind of swooshes around the circle. That's the Dragon spacecraft. And it needs to get to the top of that circle representing the International Space Station before it can properly align itself to the docking access and get ready to close in for those final few moments before docking itself. But this gives a great illustration of that flying up and over top maneuver that Endeavour is currently experiencing.
Yeah, I literally love this view. This is so awesome to see the International Space Station with Earth in the background. Again, Dragon is going to be moving to above the space station, so we'll eventually see, this is a view from Dragon, so we'll eventually see a view from Dragon looking at the space station with Earth like all behind the space station. That's how you know that Dragon will be above the space station.
And they again are currently flying over the Pacific Ocean, just about to pass over Hawaii at the moment. As Crew 11 continuing that methodical approach, now 314 meters away from the International Space Station, closing in at about 1.1 meters per second. View on the left there is the over-the-shoulder look of Commander Zena Cardman and Mike Fink, and on the right is the view from the space station to the Dragon. And again, there's the International Space Station from Dragon on the left. And on that left-hand side, you can see the great solar arrays of the International Space Station, but you can also see the IROSAs, the rollout solar arrays on that left-hand side to help enhance the power of the International Space Station, collecting that sunlight, converting it into energy for the crew on board to fly the orbiting laboratory.
And Dragon also does have solar arrays attached to the Dragon trunk It's just on half of the trunk, but similar. While Dragon is in space and while it's docked to the International Space Station, that's how the Dragon spacecraft will be powered for its duration of its mission until it comes back down for splashdown.
Now 294 meters away. The milestone we're looking to get to is 220. That is waypoint 1. And we just received note that that's going to be about 6 minutes away as Dragon Endeavour and Crew 11 continue its approach to the International Space Station, tracking approximately 2:26 a.m. Eastern Time, 11:26 p.m. Pacific Time for what has been a full day for the crew, launching earlier this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern from Launch Complex 39A in NASA's Kennedy Space Center, and then would execute a sequence of burns after a nominal orbit insertion and great performances from Stage 1 and Stage 2 of the Falcon 9. And then would begin that stair step with those burns, the phase burn, boost burn, close burn, transfer burn, and then the final co-elliptic burn to get them into the position they're in now. And then the approach initiation burn is what started our broadcast today to begin that journey towards the space station. And now hitting those milestones, waypoint 0 has come and gone. And now we're approaching waypoint 1, which again will be 220 meters that separates Dragon from the space station. There they'll join Expedition 73 and then switch over to Expedition 74 in the fall when the Soyuz crew rotation is completed, and then I'll see NASA astronaut Johnny Kim return to Earth, and NASA astronaut Chris Williams will begin his first flight, and he will make his way toward the orbiting laboratory. And that's what will transfer from Expedition 73 to Expedition 74. And currently on board and monitoring Johnny Kim, again in the cupola using the special tools to monitor Dragon's approach. Nicole Ayers will be tapped with responsibilities for hatch opening procedures. Ayers, member of Crew 10, alongside with Anne McLean of NASA, Takuya Onishi, and Kirill Peskov of JAXA and Roscosmos, respectively. And for Johnny Kim and his Soyuz MS-27 crewmates, Sergei Ryzhikov and Alexei Zubritsky of Roscosmos, that crew of 7, soon to be a crew of 11, with Crew 11 approaching. Now closing in on 3 minutes until Crew 11 reaches waypoint 1, and you can start to see the sun setting a little bit. And we talked about the orbital daytime, orbital nighttime, and that's where we're going to lean on that strobe in the middle of the Dragon spacecraft to help identify where the craft is in relationship to the International Space Station. And of course, you see the port side and starboard side red and green lights to help illustrate their direction as well.
And Crew 11 currently approaching the International Space Station. In the bottom left-hand corner, you can see the range or the distance of the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. We're at about 238 meters from the station. Waypoint 1 is about 220 meters away from the station. So we are getting pretty close to that waypoint 1.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Approach 1 and soft capture ring extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue approach to waypoint 2.
Copies. Ring extension beginning shortly. We're expecting to continue through waypoint 1 onward to waypoint 2.
And as you heard those comms, we do have these checkpoints, waypoint 0, waypoint 1, waypoint 2. You heard those comms. Basically, a go-no-go poll was performed, and the Dragon spacecraft will actually pass through waypoint 1 and just begin to waypoint 2. So great news, smooth ride, no need to stop and hold. As they mentioned, they'll just move forward to that once they pass through Waypoint 1, they'll just move forward to Waypoint 2, which is at about 20 meters away from the International Space Station. And during that movement, they also will be aligning the Dragon spacecraft with the docking adapter during that movement as well.
And that's what I was just looking at my notes real quickly, is that is going to align itself with the docking access, and it's great to hear that they can move past Waypoint 1 and move to 20 meters away, Waypoint 2, as we have now reached an orbital nighttime, and that's where we'll lean on those strobe lights, the strobe light and the starboard and port side lights of the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft to help us identify where it is in space in relationship to the International Space Station. Now, a little more than 14 hours and 26 minutes into the journey of Crew 11.
Yeah, again, the spacecraft is now above the International Space Station on the space side, so it's looking from the International Space Station to Dragon. You just see space in the background.
And the team's on the ground continuing to monitor the trajectory. We should be crossing Waypoint 1 here in just a matter of moments. Again, having them 220 meters away. You notice before we lost the data there at the bottom left-hand side, that rate of closure slowing down to now less than a meter per second. And as it gets closer and closer to the space station, it'll get even slower, almost a glacial rate of how glaciers move across.
Station Houston on the big loop for Johnny.
Station on the big loop here.
Monitor approach per step 3 of 1.102, Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. Let us know when your review is complete and you are ready for docking.
Station monitoring per step 3, the procedure review is complete and station crew ready for docking.
And that was NASA astronaut Johnny Kim talking to the teams in Houston.
And Houston copies. At Waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause to align for docking, then automatically resume approach.
Station copy.
So NASA astronaut Johnny Kim communicating with the teams on the ground of the docking procedures. The soft capture ring has also been activated from the International Space Station side, ready to receive Dragon Endeavour and Crew 11. And just a moment ago, you saw some great thruster firings of the spacecraft in the blackness of space to see it illuminate for a couple of quick moments there.
Yeah, that was definitely the cool part of this view. Even though it's all black in the background, it really highlights those thruster firings and, again, kind of shows all the different firings that need to happen to reorient the Dragon spacecraft to the checkpoints that it needs to make it to in order to dock with the International Space Station.
We talked about two imaginary boundaries around the International Space Station, the approach ellipsoid and the keep out sphere. We call it the neighborhood of the International Space Station. Well, they just reached the second of those two boundaries in the keep out sphere. So Dragon, again, getting closer and closer to the International Space Station. You heard that they received the go to proceed past Waypoint 1, and then they will pause. That was part of the communications to Johnny Kim. They will pause at Waypoint 2, make sure everything is A-OK before autonomously giving the green light to continue on to docking.
Yeah, you also heard them call out some procedures. Just a reminder that every step of this process is a very strategic and very particular process. We do have to make sure that, everything goes smooth to keep the crew on Dragon as well as on the station safe. So it's very important to follow these procedures step by step. And they're calling out to each other. They're following those procedures here on the ground as well as on the International Space Station and on Dragon. So they're all looking at the same procedure together.
And again, it's a testament to the teamwork that has to happen for all teams across the globe and across the United States, namely. And there you can see the teams here in Hawthorne, California, the SpaceX Mission Control. But we saw the teams in NASA's Johnson Space Center a little bit early on as well. From the International Space Station perspective, keeping a close eye on everything. So right now, the The views disrupted a little bit. We've had that happen throughout the broadcast today, completely expected, as communications, as the two vehicles orbiting around the Earth very fast, again, 17,500 miles an hour. They have to transfer those communications lines between satellites in order to obtain the great footage that we've been seeing so far throughout the broadcast.
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop. Visors are secure.
SpaceX copies on the big loop. Visors secure.
And another step to crew arrival to the International Space Station is they are in their suits. We've heard them do the pressure checks. Now they're putting their visors down. Again, that's just to give another level of safety and security for the crew on board Dragon Endeavour as they start making their way closer and closer from Waypoint 1 to Waypoint 2.
Yeah, exactly. Now, we did, again, get that go to pass through Waypoint 1 and begin to approach to Waypoint 2. So initial contact between Dragon and the International Space Station is expected at about 11:26 p.m. Pacific Time or 2:26 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, before reaching Waypoint 1, mission operators conducted a go-no-go poll to allow Dragon to begin its approach to Waypoint 2, which is located inside of the keep-out sphere about 20 meters from the space station.
And as mentioned previously, all these visiting vehicles take this phased approach to the International Space Station and stopping at these predetermined gates, all these waypoints that we've been mentioning. And that's for teams to run quick checks on vehicle performance before approaching the International Space Station. When it comes to bringing two spacecraft together, slow and steady wins the race, as docking operations require a great deal of precision to make sure we're keeping the spacecraft and the crew safe.
At the 20-meter distance from station's docking adapter,
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Soft capture ring extension complete.
Dragon copies. Ring extended. We see the same.
and just some comms as the soft capture ring is preparing for Dragon to approach and dock with the International Space Station. Now, at the 20-meter distance from station's docking adapter, Dragon's approach will slow, and it will begin to align itself with the adapter to come in for the final approach. And you can see that there on your graphic. We've already passed through Waypoint 1 and Waypoint 2. We're now making the crew is making their way to Waypoint 2, about 20 meters away. And then where you see contact, that is where the IDA, or the International Docking Adapter, is, and that's where Dragon will mate with the International Space Station.
And you saw that rate of closure continuing to get slower and slower. We mentioned a glacial rate almost, because you don't want anything to happen too quickly for Dragon and the International Space Station to come together. You heard the soft capture ring, and that contact with the capture ring will then retract to bring Dragon in for the hard capture sequence. And as further precaution, Dragon's soft capture system includes a set of rotary spring dampeners to lessen the force of the contact between the spacecraft and the International Space Station. You will pause a few moments to let that relative motion dampen out a little bit before continuing for the hooks to drive, form that hard mate from a soft capture to a hard mate. And there we can begin the hatch opening procedures, the leak checks, and so forth. So a lot has to happen as you start making your way closer and closer to the space station. We'll hear a lot more comms in the process as well, but to have that step-by-step procedure and be what they say, is slow is smooth, smooth is fast, and that's what they're executing right now in these final few more moments before that soft capture and docking.
Yeah, Joseph, you've mentioning that slow and steady. Again, both vehicles are moving at 17,500 miles per hour, which is really fast. So even the slightest movement, even the slightest approach, is actually the spacecraft moving very quickly with each other. So relative to each other, it seems very slow, but that is one of the biggest reasons why the Dragon spacecraft needs to approach very slowly, is because they're both moving really, really fast at the same time.
And we just received word that we are go for docking from the International Space Station.
On the big loop, ground is go for approach 2 and has commanded approach allowed. As a reminder, once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
Dragon copies. Once they are inside the crew hands-off, we will go hands-off. No retreat or breakout at that time. And we are go for approach 2. We see the flag enabled.
Communications between the team as you see that rate closure continuing on now. It's less than 68 meters away are all that separate Dragon, Endeavour, and Crew 11 from the International Space Station. A little more than a meter per second, and the great view there of Dragon from the International Space Station, that strobe light illuminating station to help out with the process. But you see those red and green lights as well, those navigation lights, similar to what you see on cruise ships or aircraft. Those red lights indicate the port, the left side of the spacecraft, while the green indicates the starboard or the right side. And these lights help with the orientation and safe navigation, particularly during moments like this, docking and undocking with the International Space Station. So great to see, but again, it's getting closer to the orbiting laboratory, now less than 56 meters away. And Waypoint 2, the next milestone we're awaiting, and that'll be the 20-meter mark. And we've heard communications from the teams here on the ground to the crew that they expect to have that Waypoint 2 mark to be a hold. They'll analyze, make sure everything is where it needs to be in terms of the alignment and trajectory before proceeding to docking. But we also heard that the ground is go and the International Space Station is go for those procedures, and we'll continue to follow along as the crew makes that methodical approach to the orbiting laboratory.
Yeah, and we are expecting docking to occur at about 11:26 p.m. Pacific time, which is about 6 minutes from now. Again, it's going to be a slow approach. The Dragon spacecraft is an autonomous vehicle, so again, all of this alignment, we are using the guidance navigation system to basically detect where that IDA is, line itself up, orientation, and then begin approach to docking, which I think is very cool. It's basically, you know, flying itself. The crew doesn't need to do anything. They just need to monitor and wait till they dock with the station.
As we get closer to that 20-meter mark, that Waypoint 2, which is at 20 meters, so you're at less than 15 meters away from reaching that milestone. You heard the communications with the crew hands-off point, the chop that happens right in those final few moments, right before the soft capture and initial contact between the International Space Station and the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft. So everything's starting to line itself up, and there you can see great thruster firings, and we'll get those views back to you here shortly. But again, that's that fine-tuning that has to occur as it lines itself up for Waypoint 2, and then those final few moments and final few bits of distance from them and the International Space Station.
Yeah, that's another thing to clarify. You mentioned CHOP. So the vehicle is flying autonomously, but the commander or pilot could take over the spacecraft manually at any moment if they needed to. So that is why we have that CHOP moment in time, that once it gets past that point, they can no longer manually override the vehicle. They will have to be hands-off, hence the crew hands-off point.
And Dragon has slowed down that rate of closure, now at 0.4 meters per second. That is less than a mile an hour. So that is kind of helps illustrate how methodical this approach has to be. And there you can see some great thruster firings illuminating in the darkness of space. As we have reached the 20-meter mark, or right on the cusp of the 20-meter mark, and Waypoint 2.
And again, they will hold for just a moment. Again, this is just a checkpoint to make sure that the vehicles are healthy and are ready for docking with the space station. And there you can see the range has stopped, meaning that the vehicle is holding its position. Again, the teams are going to be monitoring.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is on final approach and is go for docking. Monitor for steps 5 and 6 in 1.102, Dragon approach and retreat monitor.
Station docking monitoring for steps 5 and 6.
Exciting call out there. We are go for docking, and you can already see the range, already the Dragon spacecraft approaching the International Space Station.
So it has reached Waypoint 2, and that communications given the go for docking, and now it's just those final little bits of distance, and we'll continue to keep an eye on where the Dragon and the International Space Station are relative to each other, orbiting around the Earth at the time of docking. But so far, everything has been right on time, and so much so that they were even a little bit ahead of schedule going into today's preparations, following all the trajectory and data that we've been tracking since launch earlier this morning at 11:43 a.m. Eastern time, and that's what began their journey. Now 14 hours and 40 minutes into their flight today, but that'll soon come to a close as they're just a little more than 14 meters away from reaching their ultimate destination.
Yeah, very exciting. And again, just a reminder, in the bottom right-hand corner, you could see a graphic showing the Dragon spacecraft thrusters on board. We've been able to get some glimpses of the thrusters live on Dragon. You can kind of see those light dots on your screen, but it is a little bit dark. We've got a dark view as we are looking at the Dragon spacecraft from the International Space Station. Dragon is up and above the space station, between the space station and outer space.
And receive note that we're a little less than 3 minutes away from capture and contact, pardon me.
Approaching 10 meters.
Copy, 10 meters.
And 10 meters to go. So again, continuing to close the gap between Dragon Endeavour and the International Space Station, currently flying over the South Pacific, as they are down to single digits in terms of meters between the Dragon Endeavour and Crew 11 on board and the International Space Station.
We should hear that call out for CHOP just about 30 seconds before the Dragon spacecraft is expected to soft capture with the International Space Station.
Thrusters continuing to fire to push Dragon in even closer at 0.3 meters per second. Now about to be 5 meters away, and we'll wait for that contact call out.
5 meters.
Now 4 meters away. Continuing to hear him, we'll hear that CHOP call out, and we'll wait for the call of the contact.
Meters, throw his hands off.
2 meters.
There was that call out for CHOP. Crew hands
1
off.
meter.
1 meter. Dragon contact and soft capture complete.
Dragon captured.
And there's the call. NASA SpaceX Crew 11 has arrived to the International Space Station with docking at 2:27 a.m. Eastern Time, 264 miles over the Southeast Pacific Ocean.
You can also see in the bottom right-hand corner the graphic furthest to the right showing the docking adapter. Previously said
ring retraction in progress.
Copies.
That graphic previously said soft capture. Now it says hard capture, so it's following along with all the action with the docking adapter. And we did hear that call out. We heard the capturing. We are going to also have a sequence of 12 hooks, 6 at a time, that are going to lock in to that docking adapter, and then the umbilicals will then attach after that. So we should hear those call outs here shortly as well.
And if you're just joining us, NASA SpaceX Crew 11 has reached contact with the International Space Station, docking at 2:27 a.m. Eastern Time. They were 264 miles over the Southeast Pacific Ocean. And you heard the soft capture retract, now looking to form that hard mate, as you mentioned, Jesse, all part of those docking procedures. And once the hooks drive, then you can start making your way into the pressurization and hatch opening procedures and being able to follow along. But again, it'll be some time before they do all the leak checks and system checks needed to begin that procedure. But again, great to see that NASA SpaceX Crew 11 has come home to the International Space Station.
It's home for the next few months.
Crew 11 has made initial contact now and is situating itself in with those hooks driving to form the hard mate on the space-facing port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. And that soft capture system has retracted to bring the spacecraft even closer to form that hard capture. And you mentioned, Jesse, earlier that those 12 hooks, the 2 sets of 6, to firmly hold Dragon in place. That process will take about 15 minutes or so. So again, it just recently docked to the International Space Station about 2 minutes ago. So it'll take some time, and we also want to have that relative motion dampen out a little bit because, again, Dragon coming in very slowly, but still want that relative motion to dampen out. So the docking procedures well underway, and it'll take about 15 minutes or so. And after all of the docking events are successful, flight controllers will configure the Dragon spacecraft for docked operations and connect the power and data to the spacecraft. The Crew 11 crew will be able to get out of their spacesuits and set them up to dry and begin operations to get the hatches open and join the Expedition 73 crew on board the International Space Station. That includes pressurizing the vestibule and a round of leak checks, and we expect, again, to take it about 2 hours or so before the hatches open, and we'll continue to monitor along with that time frame. But again, they have docked at 2:27 a.m. Eastern Time as the space station and the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft orbiting over the Southeast Pacific Ocean. All of this will be followed by a welcoming ceremony before the crew goes into a safety briefing with the team already on board, Crew 10.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
Dragon copy is full with you.
Great to hear that communications to the ring retraction being completed. And again, the welcome ceremony and the crew will have that safety briefing with the Expedition 73 crew, and they'll get up to speed on all things International Space Station, and that'll more or less begin the handover period, the 3 full days of handover between the Crew 11 team and the Crew 10 crew as they anticipate departing in the next few days after that handover complete can occur, and of course due to weather and splashdown opportunities available for Crew 10. So now that the soft capturing has been retracted, you're going to start hearing those call outs of the hooks driving and starting to create that hard mate to the International Space Station.
Yeah, and with the completion of the soft capture ring retraction, the hard capture sequence begins just about a couple minutes later, so we should hear the call out that that hard capture procedure sequence has begun here shortly.
So right now that docking procedure well underway, and we anticipate to have, like, from initial capture to completion takes about 15 minutes or so. So we'll continue to monitor as Dragon Endeavour has reached the International Space Station after, again, launching earlier this morning a full day's activity for the crew aboard, including NASA astronaut and commander of Crew 11, Zena Cardman, pilot and NASA astronaut Mike Fink, mission specialist and JAXA astronaut Kimia Yui.
Station Houston, MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
Copy.
And to round it out real quickly, Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Platonov, as you heard the communications there, the hooks are driving now to form that hard mate and create that seal to have the spacecraft and the International Space Station locked up against each other. So we still have a few more moments to go before the docking can be completed. But it's not just the hooks as well. You need the umbilicals to be connected as well, Jesse. That's where the power, the communications comes from, to shift from using the solar panels on Dragon to provide that power for the spacecraft to then using the power provided by the International Space Station.
Yeah, exactly. It basically becomes a single unit when it's parked at the International Space Station, which I think is really cool. And again, the hard capture sequence has begun. Again, that's going to be 12 hooks driving in 6 at a time. We should hear a call out for the first 6 hooks completing and then the second 6 hooks completing. Once those 12 hooks have completed driving in, that is what completes the hard capture and completes the docking for the Dragon spacecraft to the International Space Station.
And we're continuing to monitor along. Those first set of hooks are driving as we speak, and we'll hear those be completed, and then we'll hear that second set get underway. And again, the NASA SpaceX Crew 11 has arrived to the International Space Station, docking just a few moments ago at 2:27 a.m. Eastern Time.
If you're wondering what you're looking at on your screen, we are looking at a live view from the International Space Station, looking at Dragon as it's docked to the space station, although it is a bit dark, so we do have that port side light there. That is the Dragon spacecraft on the right hand of your screen.
Both Dragon and the International Space Station in that orbital nighttime. They just flew over the most southern regions of South America as they were making their way across the Pacific Ocean. Southeast Pacific is where they met together for that initial contact, and then they'll start making their way 51 degrees and change up the other direction as we continue to wait that second set of hooks to drive. And we're about 6 minutes away from the next orbital sunrise, which should provide some wonderful views of both the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station, illuminating the two coming together. And there you can see that live map of where they are right now as they just passed again over that southern region of South America and off the east coast of the continent, making its way up into the Atlantic Ocean. So the first set of hooks have completed, and now the second set is getting underway and driving as we speak.
And if you look in your bottom right-hand corner, that graphic of the docking adapter, you could see the status. You can actually see that it's looks like it's loading, essentially in progress. That hard capture is in progress. Once that hard capture is complete, you'll see that graphic show that it's complete, which is pretty cool. Since we're not getting comms all the way through while everything's happening, this graphic helps provide a live view and status of what's going on.
So the first set of 6 have complete. Now we're awaiting the second set of 6 hooks to lock on and pull the Dragon Endeavour spacecraft even closer to the International Space Station, form the hard mate. And from there, the umbilicals, the power, the communications, everything will be transferred and connected over from Dragon running independently to being a part, as Jesse mentioned, as one unit and feeding off the power and communication system of the International Space Station. Dragon Endeavour and Crew 11 docked exactly 10 minutes ago while the two were flying a little more than 260 miles over the southeast Pacific Ocean.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, hard capture complete.
Dragon copies on the big loop, hard capture complete.
All right, great news. Hard capture is now complete. Now that Dragon has completed the docking sequence, the spacecraft must undergo a handful of checks before we will be able to open the hatch. The crew on board Dragon will now get a chance to get out of their suits before moving into hatch operations, which I'm sure they're pretty excited about.
And that's right, and things are going to start picking up now inside the International Space Station as well, as NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is going to begin the procedure of getting
Endeavour,
the station
welcome
side
to the
ready.
International Space Station. Your arrival is another milestone to what international commercial collaboration can accomplish. Zena, Mike, Kimi, and Oleg, we have cold drinks, hot food, and hugs waiting. See you soon.
This is Dragon Endeavour on the big loop. Hello, Space Station. Crew 11 is here. and we are super excited to join Expedition 73. We will do our best to also be good stewards of our beautiful ISS during our stay. The ISS has been inhabited and crewed for almost 25 years. We look forward to celebrating with you.
That was wonderful to hear.
Space Crew can't wait.
That was wonderful to hear. The communications from the International Space Station to the crew aboard Dragon Endeavour, welcoming them formally to the International Space Station. And you heard Colonel Mike Fink talking, the pilot of Crew 11. Excited to share this moment, become a part of Expedition 73, but also be a part of history as the 25th anniversary of continuous human presence for the International Space Station coming up in November. Well, now the hatch opening and pressurization, the safety checks, everything getting underway, and that's where NASA's Nicole Ayers will kick things off and get the hatch on the station side ready to be opened and start pressurizing that area known as the Vestibule, and that's between Dragon and the space station hatches. They've been at vacuum of space. They have to bring that up to a little more than 14 psi, which is about sea level for those here on Earth. And with Dragon docked, that's going to do it for us here in Hawthorne. But our coverage for Crew 11 will not stop.
That's right. In a minute, we're going to toss it over back to Sandra in Mission Control Houston, take us through the vestibule depressurization and hatch opening, when we'll see NASA astronauts Zena Cardman and Mike Fink, along with JAXA astronaut Kimya Yui and Roscosmonaut Oleg Platon.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, docking sequence complete. Ground will be enabling hardline power and comm connection shortly. You are go to DOF suits per procedure 4.012 and begin post-docking cabin configuration per 4.400 in parallel.
Tracking copies all. We are activating 4.012 and 4.400.
Great news. They're proceeding with moving forward with getting the crew on the International Space Station. And as I was mentioning, the Crew 11 crew with Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Platonov, all four of the crew will be floating into the International Space Station shortly, which is very exciting. But just a little recap of how they got here. They suited up. They took a short ride to Launch Complex 39A, where they ingressed the vehicle, the Dragon vehicle, on top of a Falcon 9 rocket. They lifted off from Kennedy Space Center Launch Complex 39A at 8:43 a.m. Pacific time, or 11:43 a.m. Eastern time on Friday, August 1st. Stage 1 came back, separated from the second stage in Dragon, came back and landed on landing zone 1, and the crew continued on their journey all day today. They've had a long phasing burn, making their way to the International Space Station. They've had 5 major burns on Dragon, and then finally docked with the International Space Station at 11:27 p.m. Pacific time on Friday, August 1st, or 2:27 a.m. Eastern time on August 2nd.
It's definitely been a full day for Crew 11, that's for sure, from launch to capture. And now that Crew 11 has arrived, we're looking ahead to the return of Crew 10. We'll be taking you along as they return home after their long-duration stay aboard the International Space Stations. Now, teams are assessing return dates, and they have announced during media breakouts that it will be no earlier than August 6th. But again, we'll continue to follow along, and it will be announced on NASA.gov, so be sure to tune in as NASA and SpaceX bring you that live coverage every step of their journey home. You can also follow us on X at SpaceX and NASA on social media for real-time updates. And again, thank you for watching. Go NASA, go SpaceX, and go Crew 11 and go Crew 10. For those of you watching on X, please head on over to NASA Plus and follow the coverage live for the welcome remarks, the hatch opening, and more.
And thank you, all of you, for joining us and being with us here in Hawthorne today. And thank you, Joseph, for being here with us today in Hawthorne, California. Thanks to everybody for tuning in.
It's been wonderful to work with you. And now we're going to toss it over to Sandra Jones at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston to continue sharing the mission as the crew prepares to board their home for the next few months, the International Space Station. Thank you.
Good morning again from the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. We just wrapped up our joint coverage with SpaceX of Crew 11's arrival to the International Space Station.
Kimmy, I've got you loud and clear on the cabin mic on the big loop.
You're also loud and clear. Thank you.
You're looking at a live view of a spacecraft that docked to the International Space Station at 1:27 a.m. Central Time this morning. This is Crew Dragon Endeavour. On board there are 4 crew members: NASA astronaut Zena Cardman, NASA astronaut Mike Fink, JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Kimiya Yui, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Platonov. The quartet launched to the International Space Station from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida just yesterday at 10:43 a.m. Central Time. Following their docking to the International Space Station about 20 minutes ago, there were procedures that were stepped through in order to create a hard capture between the Dragon spacecraft and the International Space Station. At this point, the docking sequence is now complete, which means the ring was fully retracted, the hooks were successfully driven, and the umbilical is extended, which means that Dragon is now drawing power from the International Space Station. So now we are underway for preps for the hatch opening process. We are anticipating hatch opening to occur at about 3:15 a.m. Central. However, this is a little bit variable for the time frame and can shift, so we will of course keep you updated. Following the hatch opening, we are targeting a welcome ceremony at 4:15 a.m. Central Time, which will include all 4 of the astronauts aboard Endeavour, as well as the 7 crew members on board the International Space Station.
Hey, Nicole, we can give you the early go in step 1.1 of 2.102.
Copy, I'll put it in work. Thank you.
Now that Endeavour is docked, NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is working to secure some hardware that will move into the hatch operation procedures. First, the large hatch at Node 2 Zenith will be opened, which will give her access inside the pressurized mating adapter. And then we'll have to pressurize the vestibule, which is the small space between the hatches on Dragon and the International Space Station. Because this area was exposed to vacuum prior to docking, we need to fill it with air and make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressure on Dragon and the space station. Ayers is going to use a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule. And flight controllers here in Houston will monitor the pressure and temperature readings inside to verify everything is leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. So again, we are targeting that hatch opening this morning around 3:15 a.m. Central Time. And about an hour after hatch opening, we are expecting a welcome ceremony to occur at 4:15 a.m. Central. We are continuing to get views of Dragon docked to the Zenith port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. The Zenith port is the space-facing port. Dragon did dock at 1:26 a.m. Central during a night pass, but now we are in a day pass, so we're getting some good views of Dragon. The International Space Station is currently flying 262 statute miles off the west coast of Africa. As we continue to monitor along for hatch opening procedures this morning, the main voices that you'll be hearing from inside the International Space Station are NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, who will be prime for repressurizing that vestibule we discussed, but you also hear the voice of NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, who monitored Dragon's approach from the cupola of the International Space Station. And we are getting another view here of Dragon, again docked to the Zenith port of the International Space Station. That's the space-facing port. Slightly to the left, you can make out the nose cone of another Dragon spacecraft, the Crew 10 spacecraft that is docked to the forward port of the International Space Station, or the Earth-facing port. Crew 10 will be departing the International Space Station here in the coming days, but before that takes place, the newly arrived Crew 11 crew will work through handover procedures, including a safety briefing and getting oriented to space station life. While we do have 2 returning flyers to the International Space Station, we do have 2 first-time flyers. That includes NASA astronaut Zena Cardman, who is the commander of Dragon Endeavour, as well as Oleg Platonov of Roscosmos, who served as a mission specialist aboard Dragon. Once Crew 10 undocks from the International Space Station, they will splash down off the coast of California. This will actually be the very first time that a crew, as part of NASA's Commercial Crew Program, does splash down off the coast of California. The Axiom Mission 4, one of the private astronaut missions for the agency, did recently splash down off the coast of California, but this will be the first for the CCP program.
Houston Station on to the Node 2 Cam 1 is on. You guys are welcome aboard.
Copy all. We'll put that in work.
Again, this is a view of the recently arrived Dragon Endeavour, which docked to the International Space Station at 1:26 a.m. Central Time this morning. Inside the International Space Station, NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is working through procedures to pressurize the vestibule, which is the small space between the hatches on Dragon and the International Space Station. Because this area was exposed to vacuum prior to docking, they need to have it filled with air to make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and the space station before hatches are opened. Again, the timing for hatch opening this morning is targeted at 3:15 a.m. Central.
Station on to for step 2.4, GMT time 0657.
Copy 657.
And we are getting a view from inside the International Space Station now as the crew, namely NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, works to step through those procedures to pressurize the vestibule. And we are hearing confirmation that Dragon is now receiving power from the International Space Station, so it's no longer relying on battery power or its solar arrays.
Dragon Houston, stand by for hardline audio config.
And Dragon copy, standing by.
And a view back inside the International Space Station. Again, NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers is going to be prime for the responsibility of the hatch opening procedures today. You can see that zenith hatch there on your screen. The white circular portion that's a little deeper into the hatchway and that pathway is called the pressurized mating adapter. It's the white hatch right there around it. That is called the APAS hatch, or the androgynous peripheral attach system. The international docking adapter, which is on the other side of the hatch, just right behind there, has been exposed to vacuum and the harsh conditions of space, including that intense sunlight and sunsets plus 200 degrees Fahrenheit plus or minus in the sun and shade respectively. So because of this introduces some significant thermal constraints and thermal conditions, as you might expect in that vestibule. And we are hearing that the vestibule has been repressurized by NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers. Again, she's prime for those procedures today. So next up, there will be a series of leak checks that occur. The pressurization needs to be equal to the pressure on board the International Space Station, which is about 14.7 pounds per square inch. Once that pressure is equalized, they'll be able to open up the hatches between Dragon Endeavour and the International Space Station, and the newly arrived Crew 11 will be able to float aboard at that point. Shortly after their arrival on board the International Space Station, we will have a welcome ceremony. We're again targeting that for 4:15 a.m. Central Time this morning. And we are in a brief handover period between our satellites. This is expected, and we will regain communication and views again here shortly, but you're looking at a live view inside Mission Control Houston, inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room, which is being led by Ronak Dave, the flight director there in the center of your screen standing up. He led the team during this morning's docking. That docking occurred at 1:26 a.m. Central Time. And sitting directly to his right is the Capcom, or capsule communicator, who is prime for communicating with the crew on board the International Space Station as they step through the procedures this morning for the docking and hatch opening. And looking again at the Dragon Endeavour, which docked to the International Space Station at 1:26 a.m. Central Time this morning, following its launch from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida yesterday morning at 10:43 a.m. Central. Inside, again, that docking occurred at 1:27 a.m. Central Time this morning. Inside Dragon Endeavour are NASA astronauts Zena Cardman and Mike Fink, as well as JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Kimi Yui, as well as Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Platonov. This view inside NASA's Mission Control Houston, inside the International Space Station Flight Control Room. We'll get views of Dragon and inside the International Space Station here shortly.
SpaceX Dragon suits drying.
And we are getting views once again of Endeavour docked to the zenith port of the International Space Station. Dragon is now getting power from the International Space Station, so no longer is reliant upon its solar arrays, which you can see at the top of your screen. There's the black portion on the Dragon's trunk.
Dragon Houston on the big loop. Comm check. Hardline audio config complete.
Houston, Dragon on the big loop, loud and clear.
And we have you loud and clear as well.
And as NASA astronaut Zena Cardman continues to work through the procedures ahead of the hatch opening today, she did just communicate with the CAPCOM, or capsule communicator, here in Mission Control Houston as they completed some hardline communication checks. All of this ahead of a targeted hatch opening at 3:15 a.m. Central Time this morning, so just about an hour out from that milestone. Another view here of Endeavour docked to the zenith port of the International Space Station's Harmony module. Can really see a good view of those black solar arrays there at the top of your screen, which helped provide power for Endeavour on its ride uphill following launch from the Kennedy Space Center at 10:43 a.m. Central Time just yesterday. For this launch, it was a fairly short rendezvous period. Dragon docked at 1:27 a.m. Central Time this morning, so just about a 16-hour time period from launch to docking. Inside the International Space Station, NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers has already worked to open the large hatch at Node 2 Zenith, which helped give her access inside the pressurized mating adapter. There you're seeing a view on your screen of that. She then worked to pressurize the vestibule, which is the small space between the hatches on Dragon and the space station. This was exposed to vacuum prior to docking and so needs to be filled with air to make sure its pressure is nearly equal with the atmospheric pressures on Dragon and the space station. So Ayers used a small valve on the station's hatch to slowly introduce air into the vestibule, and flight controllers here in Houston are now monitoring the pressure and temperature readings and completing a leak check to verify that everything is leak-free before we get ready to open up the hatches. And this is a view of the crew members currently on board the International Space Station, waiting to welcome the Crew 11, which docked again at 1:27 a.m. Central Time. Starting on the lower left of your screen is NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, then Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov, NASA astronaut Johnny Kim, Roscosmos cosmonaut Sergei Ryzhikov, and Alexei Zubritsky, as well as JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Takuya Onishi, and finally NASA astronaut Anne McClain. At around 4:15 a.m. Central Time this morning, we will have a welcome ceremony, which includes not only our recently docked crew members of Crew 11, but also the Expedition 73 crew. So there will be 11 crew members living and working aboard the International Space Station for a few days, while Crew 11 completes a handover period with Crew 10 before they depart and splash down off the coast of California. Along with the 11 individuals in space we just discussed, there are 3 more that are living and working aboard the Chinese space station. So there currently are 14 people in space as we speak. While on board Space Station, Crew 11 will perform research and technology demonstrations, as well as conduct maintenance activities aboard the orbiting laboratory. Crew 11 will also contribute to NASA's Artemis campaign by simulating moon landing scenarios that astronauts may encounter near the lunar South Pole. This could help show how the space station will prepare crews for deep space human exploration. The simulations will also be performed before, during, and after their mission using handheld controllers and multiple screens to identify how changes in gravity affect spatial awareness and an astronaut's ability to pilot spacecraft like a lunar lander. Again, this view of the SpaceX Dragon spacecraft named Endeavour, which previously flew NASA's SpaceX Demo 2, Crew 6, and Crew 8, as well as a private astronaut mission entitled Axiom Mission 1, which was the first private astronaut mission to the International Space Station. This flight is the 11th crew rotation mission with SpaceX to Space Station as part of NASA's Commercial Crew program, and overall the Crew 11 mission is the 16th crewed Dragon flight to the Space Station, including Demo 2 in 2020 and 11 operational crew rotations for NASA, as well as 4 private astronaut missions.
SpaceX Dragon pursuit fan.
Dragon, we're with you on the big loop.
Hey, we are 15 minutes into our suits drying. The suit fans were on, and the suit fan just suddenly turned off. I heard it audibly and verified in 5 alpha decimal 7 that the suit fan is off.
Okay, we copy. You just heard the suit fans turn off. We're going to take a closer look on the ground and get back to you.
Copy, thanks.
And that was NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers as they work through procedures inside of Endeavour, which includes removing their spacesuits following docking, sounding like the fan that is utilized to help dry those spacesuits did turn off, so the crew on the ground going to take a look at that. These spacesuits are worn during some of the more dynamic phases of flight, such as during launch and entry into orbit, as well as during the docking and undocking time period, as well as, of course, splashdown.
3.2. We are ready for 2.102 on your go.
Hey, Nicole, you read our minds. Good leak check. You're a go per step 3.1.
I'm going step 3.1. Thanks.
And NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers reporting from the International Space Station that the leak checks are looking good for that vestibule repressurization. Again, that has to be done before the hatch can be opened, and there we are seeing a view of her on our screen as she works to open up that A-pass hatch. This is the first space flight for NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers. She launched on Crew 10 on March 14th. Prior to her time at NASA, she is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force.
And we concur. 0 DPDT.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for suit fan follow-up.
Ready to copy.
We took a closer look on the ground, and we do see that the suit fans are still running and have nominal telemetry. We did see that the waist fan turned off around the time of your call. Could that have been what you heard?
That is possible.
So we're tracking about 19 minutes into the suit drying period now.
Yeah, affirm. Our timer is about 20 minutes.
And this view of NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers as she works to open up the A-pass hatch following the vestibule repressurization and leak checks, everything looking good.
On the big group, inventory report.
Kimia, I'm with you on the big loop for the inventory report. Ready to copy.
Okay, first, water. 203, 1 remaining. 204, 4 remaining.
I copied 203, 1 remaining, 204, 4 remaining.
That's a good copy, and that's including the flashing this room. And next for the food, 302, 2 remaining. 304, 3 remaining.
I copied 302, 2 remaining, 304, 3 remaining.
That's all good copy. Thank you.
And Kimia, can you report number of waste system uses?
We're going to report this for the private medical conferences. Sorry.
Copy that. No change from PMC.
sorry, not that's true. We used a little bit more, but we're going to report during the PMC. Sorry.
Okay, copy additional uses and we'll report during PMC.
That's good copy. Thank you.
And those words from JAXA astronaut Kimi Yu reporting some of the supplies the crew used on the flight uphill. Continuing to get a view inside of the International Space Station, though, as NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers has put on some gloves and has acquired a camera. She's going to inspect the hatch for any FOD or foreign object debris to make sure everything is nice and clean before they do go ahead and open up the hatches. This is a very choreographed set of procedures.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for a follow-up question on water bottle inventory.
Go ahead.
Could you confirm inventory in bags 201 and 202?
So we're going to confirm 202, 201 and 202, but we didn't use that. So I'm going to confirm that.
Okay, we copy no consumption from 201 or 202, and 203 and 204 were as reported.
That's correct.
And on your screen now appearing is JAXA astronaut Takuya Onishi, who is helping Ayers with a light that he passed along as she works to photograph and inspect that area. And we do see that hatch open now. Again, Ayers is going to continue to inspect the area, take some photographs, and we'll send this down to the ground for further analysis ahead of the completion of hatch opening. And if you're just joining us this morning, you are looking at a live view inside the International Space Station as Nicole Ayers of NASA works to step through hatch opening procedures following the docking of Crew 11 at 1:20.
Station on 2, the AFAS hatch is open and there was no condensation.
Copy, hatch open, good report.
Following Crew 11's docking at 1:27 a.m. Central Time this morning. You did just hear her report out that following the A-Pass hatch opening, there was no reported condensation, so they'll continue to step through the rest of the carefully choreographed procedures ahead of hatch opening this morning. We are targeting 3:15 a.m. Central for that hatch opening, but that time frame can be a little bit flexible. Crew 11 launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida yesterday at 10:43 a.m. Central. Once the hatches are open and Crew 11 floats on board the International Space Station, we'll have a welcome ceremony this morning at 4:15 a.m. Central Time. During this welcome ceremony, the 4 astronauts on board Crew 11, as well as the 7 astronauts currently on board Space Station, will have the opportunity to give some remarks. And following the welcome ceremony, the crew will jump right into a safety briefing as they work through handover procedures with Crew 10, which will soon be departing the International Space Station, where they will splash down off the coast of California. This will be the very first crewed spacecraft for NASA's Commercial Crew program that splashes down off the coast of California. And now coming into view in the hatch area as well is NASA astronaut Johnny Kim. He monitored Crew 11's arrival to the International Space Station and their docking this morning from the space station's cupola. Air is now working to stow some of the tools that were utilized in that A-Pass hatch opening. Once this portion of the procedures is complete, the crew inside of the Dragon will then work to open up the hatch on their side. Following this, the IMV ducting that you saw, some of that orange and white hose-looking hardware will work to be further installed as well.
Houston, station and SpaceX. Station on 2. Station is ready for Dragon hatch equalization.
SpaceX copies on the big loop.
And Houston copies on the big loop.
Houston and SpaceX, Dragon copies. Dragon is ready for hatch equalization as well.
Station and Dragon, stand by for equalization. Expected to take 1 to 2 minutes.
And this view on your screen, there in the center of your screen, is NASA astronaut Johnny Kim assisting in the hatch opening procedures. Straight in front of him is that hatch that the crew has been working in that we've had a more close-up view of. And there is NASA astronaut Ann McClain. And back in closer of the hatch there, you can see Nicole Ayers as well as Johnny Kim continuing to step through those procedures.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, looking for permission to bring cameras back on board before we open the hatch.
SpaceX Dragon, we are good to go and just removed the video director override via 4.012.
We see it. Thank you. Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, you are go for hatch opening per the decal, followed by the remaining actions in 4.400. After 4.400 is complete, transition to NASA procedure 2.102, part Charlie.
Dragon copies. We are go for Dragon hatch open. We'll be starting that shortly, and after that, we'll complete 4.400 and transition to ISS procedure 2.102, section Charlie.
And you're looking at our first views inside of Dragon as the crew got out of their spacesuits and put them in a configuration to dry as per the procedures following docking. They're now working to open up the hatch on the Dragon Endeavour before they float on board the International Space Station. Again, 2 of them for the very first time. That will be NASA astronaut Zena Cardman and Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Platonov. This will be NASA astronaut Mike Fink's 4th time on board space station and the 2nd for Kimi Yui. And it looks like the Dragon hatch is in the process of being opened up. You can see it on the right side of your screen there in the top right.
SpaceX Dragon hatch is open.
Houston copies. Hatch open.
And with that, the Dragon hatch is open. That hatch opening occurring at 2:46 a.m. Central Time, following a docking at 1:27 a.m. Central Time this morning. And with the hatches open, it will be just another moment before the crew does float aboard the International Space Station. They have some important closeout duties, including working through procedures with some lithium hydroxide canisters. Those are consumable carbon dioxide scrubbers used inside of Dragon, so they do want to conserve those carbon dioxide scrubbers. And back inside the International Space Station, on their hatch side, you see Johnny Kim there waiting to take some photographs of the crew as they float aboard. A little further in the hatch, I believe that is NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, who's stepping through those procedures for hatch open.
Step 6.1 of 2.102, IMV duct installation is complete. We are go for IMV fan activation.
We copy. Putting that in work.
And back inside Dragon, the crew is stepping through those final preparations ahead of floating on board Space Station.
Dragon SpaceX on Dragon Aground. The S-band will be deactivated shortly, so Dragon Aground will no longer be available for comms. Please verify the push-to-talk destinations are set to ISS.
Dragon copies, Wilco.
And Dragon Houston on the big loop. When you get to step 6.3, you are go.
And Dragon copies Houston. We are ready for 6.3. We're opening location 23 at this time.
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop, 2.102, step 6.5. LiO cartridge 1 is sealed and installed.
SpaceX copies on the big loop. LiO cartridge is sealed and installed.
And those comms about that LiO cartridge that we did discuss earlier, which helps scrub the carbon dioxide from the Dragon capsule.
Houston and SpaceX. Dragon arrival configuration complete.
Houston copies.
And SpaceX copies. And as the crew continues to step through those procedures ahead of floating on board, it shouldn't be too much longer now, but as we mentioned, this is a carefully choreographed procedure, so we want to make sure everything is as expected and in a good configuration before they come on board Space Station. And this view inside of the International Space Station Flight Control Room, showcasing the team that has been working to step through the procedures with the crew for docking.
And if you're just joining us, we are awaiting Crew 11 to come on board the International Space Station following their docking at 1:27 a.m. Central this morning. The hatches were opened at 2:46 a.m. and it looks like we are having our first crew member float aboard right now. That is NASA astronaut Mike Fink for his 4th visit to the International Space Station. And it looks like his microgravity skills never left him. Joining in the hatch is NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers, who has helped step through all of the hatch opening procedures. Once the crew does float on board the International Space Station, we are targeting a welcome ceremony this morning at 4:15 a.m. Central. Again, if you're just joining us, Crew 11 docked to the International Space Station's Zenith port of the Harmony module at 1:27 a.m. Central Time. Now coming through the hatch is Roscosmos cosmonaut Oleg Platonov. This is his very first visit to the International Space Station. Some big hugs there with NASA astronaut Nicole Ayers and Johnny Kim. And continuing to get a warm welcome aboard the International Space Station for him, again, first-time flyer. And next through the hatch is JAXA, or Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency astronaut Kimi Yu. And now we have NASA astronaut Mike Fink for his 4th time to the International Space Station. And now coming into view is Zena Cardman. Again, her first time on board the International Space Station as well. Lots of smiles and hugs. 11 humans on board the International Space Station now.